Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Skievers Idle Book Club. This stream is for Novak. Hello, Ali. Hello. This stream is for Novak because he was annoying me yesterday about it. And also for Ali as well. This stream's for you too. Since you guys were interested in this book too, that was the reason that I chose this series, because it's not available for you on Audible. So I'm going to start by buying some stuff. So I'm going to buy a time machine. And I will wait till at least I see Novak in the chat before I start reading the next chapter, because he will be upset if I start without him. Yes, story time with Skeeves. Very true. Let's buy 10 more of those, and 10 more of those, and 10 more of those, and I don't think I'll be able to buy 10 of those. Oh no, I can! Yay! Also, let's buy this, twice as efficient. Let's buy that too. And that. And that. And that. Okay. Let's sloppy kisses, eh? Let's see what that achievement is for. There it is. Have 50 grandmas. Nice. 50 grandmas. Love it. Yay. I'm going to send Novak a text and say, "We waiting for you." And he'll be like, "I'm here." Oh, there you are. There you are. I knew you were about to be like, "I'm here." Yeah. So, I am waiting for you. Yes. So, let me just buy a couple more of them. I've just got so much money now, it's like not even funny. Yeah, 50 grandmas. Oh, I only could get 43. That's really mean. What was the achievement I just got? 50 farms and 50 factories. Wow. That's rude. That is rude. That's rude. Banned. Blocked. I take it back. This stream is no longer for Novak. It is only for Ali. Only for Ali. Thank you, Ali. Thank you. It's really annoying me. I need to at least take this up to 48 and then... Okay, it's up to 48. So then I will get to reading chapter 10, I think we're up to. Sharky did chapter 10. Sharky did go back and put in later how what chapters we read through, so he changed the name of the thing. I'm like, I literally I can't think. I can't even. This baby makes me not be able to think. Alright, now we're up to 50, so thank you, Ali, thank you, Novak. So we'll start reading chapter 10 and then we'll come back to this. Chapter 10. Tilda's fever broke 4 days later. Kiva was both relieved and concerned. Relieved because it meant the woman might survive the sickness that was still flooding her immune system. Concerned because There were now only 3 days left before the Crown Prince and Princess arrived to witness the trial by air. She was running out of time. Even though Tilda no longer sweated through her sheets every hour and was waking up for longer periods, Kiva still couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. The woman couldn't, or wouldn't, speak, and not even Kiva's gentle encouragement could get her to shed any light on her illness. At times she appeared lucid, but then moments later she would be overcome by delirium, wrestling against her bindings, frothing at the mouth, and screaming loud enough to have guards sprinting for the infirmary. Kiva didn't know what to do or how to help her, and on top of that, she was exhausted, not only from the increased cases of stomach virus, but also from helping prisoners who were seeking her out for other troubles, a growing number of which stemmed from altercations with the guards. This deep into winter, with very few arrivals, the guards were ill-tempered and bored. They sought entertainment in the form of women prisoners, sometimes men. After 10 years, Kiva was used to it, but that didn't stop the burn of hatred she felt when fearful women came in droves asking for barren bark to stave off their cycles. The grueling nature of labour and limited rations meant that most of the female inmates didn't bleed at all, but for those who did, the last thing anyone wanted in Zalandov was to fall pregnant. It happened, of course, and in the rare cases when a woman had gone to full term, Kiva had assisted with delivery, but not once in her decade at the prison had a mother and a newborn child survived for long. Kiva took precautions herself, but thanks to her work hours being longer than most and her assumed loyalty to the warden, she usually avoided the attention of the guards. She wasn't always immune, as had been the case a few weeks earlier when Nari had intervened. But while she'd suffered through being their plaything a handful of times over the years, they'd always stopped before going too far, as if aware that they might need medical aid from her in the future. It was both a blessing and a curse. A blessing, since she was saved from complete violation, but a curse because she could not do anything to protect others. Sometimes she slept in the infirmary, not only to avoid the restless guards, but also to be available around the clock for those in need of her. It was one of those nights, in the early hours of the morning, that Kiva was awakened by a low keening sound. She'd sent Alicia and Nurgle away when they'd arrived for their shift, claiming that she wanted to monitor some of the quarantine patients. In truth, Nari had warned Kiva not to walk back to her cell block alone that night, and since the guard had been needed elsewhere, she couldn't provide an escort. Kiva had reeled for hours after her warning. She'd wonder if it was because Nari was a woman, or if it was simply because she was a decent human being, despite her role at Zalandov. Whatever the reason, Kiva was grateful, and after sending Tip away earlier than usual and telling him to stay close to Jaren, she had remained inside the infirmary and curled up on a pallet when she could no longer keep her eyes open. The low keening sound came again, and Kiva stirred more fully, fighting the sleep that tried to pull her back under. When she realized the noise was coming from Tilda and that it wasn't an incomprehensible sound, but rather a moaned word, she sat up, shoving her legs over the side of the bed and shuffling over to the woman. "Water, water." Tilda was straining against her bindings, shaking her head from side to side, staring blindly into the low-lit room. "I'm here," Kiva told her, placing a calming hand on her shoulder. "I'll get you some water." Kiva's heart was pounding in her ears as she rushed to collect a tumbler and dunked it into a pail of fresh water. Vaguely, she noted that a guard was stationed at the door to the infirmary, someone else she didn't recognize. The armed man was peering curiously toward Tilda, no doubt listening closely. Discomforted by the thought that he'd been watching them both sleep, Kiva avoided eye contact with him and hurried back to her charge, gently raising the ill woman's head and holding the tumbler to her lips. Tilda drank eagerly enough that some of the water trickled down her chin, and once she was finished, Kiva dabbed it dry. You're welcome," Kiva said, swallowing a lump in her throat. Only one full day remaining before the first ordeal, and despite her fever having broken earlier that week, there had been little improvement in Tilda's condition. Seeing her finally try to communicate now, Kiva had to swallow again, a wave of emotion rising up within her. She wasn't supposed to become attached to her patients. That was the first rule of being the prison healer, any healer for that matter, but especially one at Zalandol's. And yet this woman, Kiva couldn't help feeling connected to her. Don't let her die. Do you know where you are? Kiva asked quietly, dragging over a stool and sitting beside Tilda's bed. She wasn't sure if the woman understood her words, but she had to at least try. Even with the guard listening in and likely reporting everything back to the warden, she would just have to be careful. Both of them would have to be careful. Zalandov, that's right, Kiva said encouragingly. She noted that Tilda was having trouble with her speech, adding it to the list of symptoms that might help her find a cause for the illness. An idea came to her, and she said, I'll be right back. Jumping in, Kiva hurried across to her supplies and pulled out a pot of gumwort that Tip had already ground into a paste. The sludgy brown colour was unappealing, but it smelled like fresh herbs, and aided with relaxation and clarity. Hoping it would loosen Tilda's words, Kiva returned to her side and asked her to open her mouth. The woman hesitated, and Kiva feared she would resist, possibly even try to fight her around the restraints. But after a beat, Tilda did as asked, and Kiva smeared some of the gumwort onto her tongue. After giving the paste enough time to take effect, Kiva asked, Can you tell me your name? The woman's lips opened and closed before she finally said, Tilda. I'm Tilda. Her throat bobbed as if she were trying to swallow, but the effort pained her. Where am I? A breath whooshed out of Kiva, even while her heart sank. Hearing Tilda say her own name, Kiva felt like she was finally getting somewhere, at least until Tilda questioned where she was, right after having already answered that herself. You're in Zalandov, remember? Kiva asked slowly. The woman blinked sightlessly up toward the ceiling. Zalandov? Yes. Where? Kiva's heart continued to shrivel. You arrived 10 days ago, she shared, unsure what else to say. Tilda gave a small surprised jerk. You've been very sick. I'm trying to make you better. Why? One sharp word, and Kiva found she didn't know how to answer. There were so many reasons, most of which she couldn't say, especially with the guard listening in. Don't let her die. Because we're the trials, Tilda interrupted, her voice beginning to sound weaker again. My sentence. Why? She inhaled a rattling breath and with visible effort continued. Why keep me alive only so I can die? The broken words had Kiva fisting her hands in her lap, her nails digging into her flesh. Of all the things for Tilda to know, to remember, why did she have to ask about the trials? What was Kiva to say? Too many answers sprang to her mind. Because it's my job. Because the warden ordered me to. Because my sister wrote me a note. Because Cresta will kill Tip if I don't. Because I won't be able to live with myself if... Where am I? Tilda asked again, interrupting Kiva's thoughts. Slumping in on herself, Kiva was just about to repeat that Tilda was in Zalandov, but then she paused, wondering if perhaps that wasn't what Tilda was really asking. With a quick look at the guard, Kiva weighed her words, and seeing no harm in it, answered, You're in the infirmary, Zalandov's infirmary. A moment of silence fell, until Tilda asked, her voice a mere whisper now, Who are you? With another quick look at the guard, Kiva offered the most honest reply that she dared. Someone who wants you to survive this. All of this. She reached out and impulsively gave Tilda's hand a squeeze, before coming to her senses and releasing her quickly. You should rest. We can talk again tomorrow. But when morning dawned, Tilda had slipped back into her delirium. Not even the gumwort worked this time. The hours trickled by, and Kiva waited to see if the woman would return to herself. But her hope was in vain. Tilda was still too sick, fully at the mercy of whatever ailed her, and when the following day arrived, the day of the first ordeal, Kiva knew she was out of time. Don't let her die. Don't let her die. Don't let her die. Kiva didn't sleep a wink that night, praying Tilda would make a miraculous recovery, and that she would then have some way of surviving the trial by air. As Kiva had told Tip, the first task wasn't always impossible to overcome, more often used to tease the offender into believing they stood a chance of survival, which ultimately proved in vain. Once they reached the second, third, or fourth ordeals, and yet, even if the difficulty level was lowered for the first, it would still be a challenge for any able-bodied person, which Tilda currently was not. Don't let her die. The first 4 coded words from her sister's note kept swimming across Kiva's thoughts. The order, the demand, and then there was Cresta's threat, her hissing voice repeating over and over, "Save the rebel queen, and you save the boy. If she dies, he dies." Kiva's mind was a battleground. Do not let her die. If she dies, he dies. Don't let her die. If she dies, he dies. Kiva had no idea how to save Tilda, how to save Tip. There was only one way she could think of that might work, but the risk and the cost. Don't let her die. If she dies, he dies. When Nari arrived at the infirmary just before midday, her face grim. Kiva's stomach was in knots. "It's time," Nari said. But she's still so sick," Tip said, his fingers closed around Tilda's limp arm, as if to comfort the woman. Tilda was awake, but she wasn't coherent. She was mumbling to herself and staring out at nothing, her body twitching with a muscle spasm every few seconds. "I have my orders," Nari said unapologetically. "Prince Deverick and Princess Mirren have arrived, and they don't intend to stay longer than they have to." Kiva fought against rolling her eyes. What a shame it would be for the royals to have to spend any amount of time in this hole. Everworld forbid that they saw what really happened behind the walls, the fatal work, the vicious grounds, the poor conditions. The moment they left this place, they'd be headed straight back to their winter palace, giving no further thought to the prisoners and their daily challenges. And why should they? Kiva mused scornfully. As far as the royals were concerned, everyone in Valandov was guilty and deserved to be there. "Can she walk?" Nari asked. Kiva said, "Yes." Sorry. Kiva didn't want to answer, but the look Nari sent her was clear. Today Nari was a Zalandov guard, just like all the others. There would be no yielding, no compassion. "Yes," Kiva said hoarsely, "but she needs help. She has no idea what's happening." Nari's jaw tightened, the slightest hint of how she felt about this, but still she nodded. "Get her up. The rest of the guards are assembling the prisoners in the eastern quad." She paused. "Be prepared. They've called everyone in from their work assignments." "Guess the royals want an audience," Tip said, his young face pale. Kiva, however, was stuck on Nari's mention of the eastern quad. Not only was it the furthest point inside the grounds from the infirmary, but it was also where the gallows stood. Was that what they had in store for Tilda? Was she to be hanged for the trial by air, to see if she could survive a broken neck, or more likely death by suffocation? Surely not. No one survived the gallows. Prisoners were hung every week, and all of them ended up in the morgue. There was no way that Tilda would. "We need to move," Nari said, as 3 more guards appeared at the door to the infirmary, waiting to escort them. "Now." Feeling numb, Kiva loosened Tilda's shackles and the strap over her chest. She wished the woman would fight, as she had a week ago, revealing that some kind of spirit remained in her. But there was nothing, just more muttering under her breath and twitching as Kiva and Tip slung her arms over their shoulders and followed Nari and her fellow guards from the infirmary. Kiva hadn't carved Tilda's left hand. She hadn't had the heart to do it. Not with the woman so ill. That meant Tilda was the only prisoner at Zalandov without a Z scarred into her flesh. She hadn't even been given a metal identification band, and yet everyone knew exactly who she was. The rumour mill had spiralled in the time since Cresta had confronted Kiva in the shower block, with it now public knowledge that the rebel queen was among them. Whispers were circulating around the prison, some resentful, some reverent. The unsettled atmosphere concerned Kiva. The energy in the air, similar to what she'd felt in the past before the inmates were tipped over the edge and into another riot. That was the last thing she needed, on top of everything else. As they dragged the ill woman across the grounds, Kiva's mind kept travelling back to Tilda's left hand. Should Kiva have carved her flesh? What if one of the guards noticed she was unscarred? If the rebel queen died today without bearing Zalendorf's symbol, was she really a prisoner, or was she still free? Kiva realized from her scattered thoughts she was panicking and made herself inhale deeply. It didn't help that the closer they stepped to the end of their walk, the more prisoners they had to wade through. Their murmurs grew in volume, at first like the buzzing of insects, but by the time the quad came into view, Kiva could barely hear her own mind. If not for Nari and the 3 guards pushing the masses aside, they wouldn't have made it through the crowd at all. It seemed like Zalendorf's entire population was waiting in anticipation for what was coming. When the gallows rose up before them, Kiva's stomach lurched so violently that she feared she might vomit. But when she made herself look closer, she saw that there was no noose dangling from the beam, no hangman waiting beside the lever. What she did see, however, was a small group of people standing atop the platform, safely out of the reach of the prisoners below. The warden was there, his back straight and head high as he stared emotionlessly out at the crowd. No other prison guards accompanied him. Instead, there was an unmistakable armour of royal guard, glinting silver in the midday sun, the kingdom's deadliest protectors encircling 2 district figures. They were both dressed in heavy winter cloaks that covered them from head to toe, and from their bearing alone, it was clear they did not belong in a place like Zalendorf. Kiva tried to get a look at their faces, but not only were they surrounded by their guards, they were also wearing masks. She heard rumours that the Valentus heirs concealed their faces during public events, and she wondered if it was a power play of some kind. Another way of highlighting just how out of reach they were from commoners. Because of those masks, all Kiva could tell was that the Crown Prince was taller than his sister, and both of them had fair hair. Looking at them and their guards, Kiva felt both hot and cold at once. She was shaking, but whether it was from fear for Tilda or outrage at this entire spectacle, she wasn't sure. All she knew was that they were steps away from the base of the gallows where Tilda would have to face her first ordeal, and her almost certain demise. Don't let her die. If she dies, he dies. Kiva gritted her teeth, sweat beading on her brow despite the icy wind. Don't let her die. If she dies, he dies. Kiva couldn't stop the trial, couldn't save Tilda from what would happen the moment she climbed those gallows steps, couldn't save Tip, couldn't save ourselves. 3 lives hung in the balance, all because of one woman. Don't let her die. Kiva closed her eyes, her heart thumping in her ears, drowning out the jeers of the crowd. She knew what she had to do. Nausea swelled within her. She snapped her eyes open, frantically searching for a familiar face among the sea of prisoners. Mott was nowhere to be seen, nor were Alicia and Nurgle. Desperate, her gaze landed on Jaren, standing with the rest of the tunnelers near the foot of the gallows, his features so covered in dust that he was almost unrecognizable. Jaren, Kiva screamed over the cat-calling masses, ignoring the warning that Nari shot back at her. Jaren! He looked puzzled by her summons, almost alarmed, his eyes flicking up to the royals and their guards as if fearing their attention. What are you doing? Tip yelled at her from Tilda's side, barely audible over the cries and shouts of the prisoners pressing in on them. She ignored him and slowed their pace, relief and dread coursing through her when Jaren started wading his way through the horde, reaching them mere paces from the gallows steps. Stay here, Kiva ordered both him and Tip, unwrapping Tilda's arm from around her neck and unceremoniously swapping places with Jaren, leaving him to help support the sick woman. Without a word of explanation, she forced her way through what remained of the near-suffocating crowd and bounded straight past Nari and the 3-guard escort, taking the steps 2 at a time until she stood at the top of the wooden platform. Immediately, 5 sword tips were pointed at Kiva as the royal guard leapt into action. Conversely, Warden Rook became as still as a statue, his diamond-shaped scar almost hidden by how far his eyes had widened upon her appearance. The audience hushed in an instant. "Who are you, girl?" the closest guard demanded. "Where's the rebel queen? Don't let her die." Drawing in a wobbly breath, Kiva straightened her shoulders and looked beyond the guards to the masked prince and princess, declaring in a loud voice the only words that would keep Tilda alive. "My name is Kiva Meriden, and I claim her sentence as my own." Bum, bum, bum. Imagine if that was the chapter that I finished on last time, Novak. 50 mines, and what's that one? Bake a billion cookies, nice. Whoops. Let's buy some more shipments. $38. $39. Genetically modified cookies, nice. All chocolate cookies, eh? 100 billion. The time paradox result. I need one more of these, please. I mean, I know that really doesn't do anything that much these days, because my other things are just so efficient. I haven't looked at these down here. Look at my time machine. I need 46 million. Thanks. 31, 32, 33. Only 10 million to go. 1, 2, 3, 4. You could have stopped it, Grandma. Could have stopped what? The apocalypse? The blip? Could I have stopped Thanos? Local news station runs a 10-minute segment about your cookies. Success. You win a cookie. Nice. Alright. The next chapter. Hope you all are ready for this. A deafening quiet fell when Kiva uttered her words, but it was quickly followed by an uproar from the gathered crowd, the wave of sound so loud that she staggered on the platform. "Silence!" The amplified roar came from the guard nearest to the prince and princess, where the other royal guards had an emblem over their hearts etched in a darker shade of silver. His was engraved in gold, 4 quadrants representing elemental magic: earth, fire, water, and air. Behind a sword crossed with an arrow and topped with a crown, the Valentis family crest. "Let her through," ordered the man with the gold emblem. The captain of the royal guard, Kiva realized. Her knees nearly gave out. The guards lowered their swords, and she stepped forward on shaking legs, her heart galloping in her chest. They didn't stand down completely, their stance warning of immediate action, should she make the slightest wrong move. It felt like an eternity passed as Kiva made her way to the center of the platform. She didn't dare make eye contact with the still frozen warden, nor did she look up at the hangman's beam rising into the air above her. She tried to remind herself that the first ordeal was the easiest, and offenders could, and did, live through it. She refused to think beyond that, to consider the repercussions of her hasty actions, or wonder what the later trials might bring. The chance of surviving even this one. Kiva knew she might have just signed away her own life, all to spare Tilda's. Don't let her die. In that moment, Kiva hated her sister, hated Cresta, hated Warden Rook and the Valentis family, and even the Miravan rulers who had sent Tilda to Zalandok to begin with. And yet, Kiva had made her own choice. She would live or die with the consequences. When she was only feet away from the captain, he shifted, the movement slight enough, but enough for her to know to not to sorry. When she was only feet away from the captain, he shifted, the movement slight, but enough for her to know not to come any closer. Kiva made herself look at him, taking in his salt and pepper hair and his trim moustache, leading to a short, neat beard. His weathered features suggested he wasn't just a figurehead of the Royal Guard, but that he had seen action, and plenty of it. As if Kiva didn't know already. It's all right. Everything will be all right. Her father's voice slammed into her, tearing open her heart, causing her breath to hitch, but she shoved the memory away, needing to give her full attention to the man before her, while offering no indication that she knew who he was, that she remembered him. The captain's brown eyes locked with hers, and he said, "Explain yourself, Kiva Meriden." Just hearing her name in his gravelly voice had her struggling to keep from bolting off the platform and disappearing into the watching crowd. But she couldn't do that. She wouldn't do that. She made her decision, and now she would see it through. "As I said, Captain," Kiva said in a clear voice, relieved when it didn't reveal her inner turmoil, "I claim the Rebel Queen's sentence as my own." "And what gives you the right to do that?" he countered, arching a dark grey eyebrow. Kiva was aware of how many eyes were on her, the collective audience straining to hear her words, the prisoners, guards, royals. She could feel the warden's gaze burning in its intensity. Somewhere in the crowd, Cresta and her rebels were watching, Jaren and Tip and Nari were watching. Everyone was watching. Sweat trickled down Kiva's spine, while goosebumps pricked at her chilled skin. Praying that she recalled the correct wording and the whispers she'd heard about it were accurate, Kiva declared. The fifth rule of the trial by ordeal, as written in the book of the law, states, should another claim the accused's sentence as their own, then he or she shall face the trials as the accused champion. Kiva held the captain's eyes, noting the look of surprise, perhaps even respect, on his face. It made her more confident that what she said was true, enough that she continued, "I made the claim. By laws, you uphold it. I'm hereby Tilda Quarantine's champion." A sudden bark of laughter had Kiva's neck swiveling toward the royals. "I like her," the Crown Prince said, amusement clear in his voice, even if the mask hid his expression. "She's got spirit." "She's got a death wish," the princess countered, though she too seemed entertained. Kiva burned with resentment toward them both, and swiftly turned back to the captain, but not before seeing the stormy look on Warden Rook's face. She swallowed, realizing her interference must have inconvenienced his plan for the Rebel Queen. He claimed not to care whether she lived or died, but Kiva knew his life would be easier if Tilda perished in today's trial. Her sentence would be delivered by her failure, her execution legal in the eyes of the law. Zalandov held little regard for justice, but with all of Wendrell watching, Rook was being careful. His dark look told Kiva one thing. If she survived the first ordeal, she would be answering to him. "I don't think you understand the ramifications of your claim, girl," the captain said, folding his massive arms over his armoured chest. "The second half of that rule states that your fate will be tied to hers. If you fail to pass all 4 trials, both of you die." A murmur rippled over the listening crowd. "No, Kiva, don't." Kiva blocked out Tip's cry. She was doing this not just for Tilda, but also to save Tip's life, and her own. She would not be swayed, even as she felt the light-headed sensation of panic gripping her, pins and needles prickling her fingertips, her vision blackening at the edges. Mustering courage she did not feel, Kiva dug her fingernails into her palms. The pain helped her focus as she declared, "And if I succeed, both of us will be granted freedom." She saw no point in admitting how the odds were against her. Everyone already knew. But if Kiva could make it through this first task, "We are safe. Stay alive. Don't let her die. We are coming. We are coming." Kiva had to believe this was what her sister's note had meant, that now, after 10 years, they were finally coming, ready to fulfill their promise, especially now that Tilda was here, an added incentive for her followers to risk making a massive move against Zalandov, freeing Kiva in the process. That was what Cresta's threat had implied. that a rescue attempt was in motion. The Meriden family, Skievers family, had a complicated history with the rebels. Young as she had been when she was taken from them, she still remembered. Her parents had tried to stay removed from the political unrest growing within Avalon, their little village tucked away at the base of the Armine Mountains, largely forgotten by outsiders. But things had changed in 10 years since Kiva had been imprisoned. Just as she had done what was needed to survive, so too, it seemed, had her family. Maybe, just maybe, if she could live through the first trial, if she could buy Tilda more time, long enough to keep Cresta off her back, for the rebels to come, for Kiva's family to come, maybe she would finally see her freedom. Don't let her die. We are coming. The princess stepped forward, her fur-lined red cloak rustling with the movement, pulling Kiva from her hopeful, if desperate, thoughts. Why risk your life? Princess Mirren eyed Kiva from behind her mask. Why make such a claim, knowing that it can only have one outcome? Kiva didn't waste her breath arguing that there could be a second outcome, that she could live. Instead, she simply said, The woman you've sentenced is deathly ill, unable to stand on her own, let alone attempt today's ordeal. Travelled a long way to be entertained, Princess. Rather than ask my reasons, why don't you just sit back and enjoy the show as intended? Unlike the prince, whose golden mask fully hid his expression, the princess's mask was like melted silver, flowing from one half of her face diagonally to the other. As such, her red lips were visible enough to be seen twisting into a smirk, moments before she stated, definitely a death wish. And then Kiva was shooting into the air. One moment her feet were on the wooden gallows platform. The next there was nothing beneath her, nothing holding her as she flew upward, yanked by an invisible chain. The bitter wind slapped her face, a breath catching in her lungs, and trapping a scream in her throat. She had barely seconds to wonder what was happening. Was this the ordeal? What was she supposed to do? How was she supposed to survive? Before her upward momentum halted and she came crashing down again. Sheer terror took hold in the single second that passed before her feet slammed into a solid surface, her body crumpling into a pile when her legs were unable to hold her weight. She wasn't dead, but she wasn't safely on the ground either. Instead, as Kiva rose, dread coiled within her when she realized that she was on top of one of the freestanding watchtowers that overlooked the eastern quad, perpendicular to the outer wall. She was so high, so high. A thump behind her had Kiva whirling to find the captain of the Royal Guard landing nimbly mere paces away, having also been delivered by the princess's elemental magic. Be thankful Princess Mirren didn't drop you from much higher, or you wouldn't be standing right now, the captain said, noting Kiva's full body trembles. Kiva feared she was going to be sick. She hoped that if her dignity fled in such a manner, she could at least ruin the captain's polished boots in the process. The prince and princess have agreed to accept your claim, transferring Tilda Quarantine's sentence to you, as per Rule 5 in the Book of the Law. The captain continued. His gaze was steady on her when he added, If the reports of her ill health are true, you're sacrificing your life for no reason, so I'm giving you one last chance to rescind your claim. Kiva said nothing, partly because she was afraid that if she opened her mouth, she would do exactly what the captain had offered. But she reminded herself, all the same, all she had to do was take the trials one step at a time. She could do this. She would do this. Don't let her die. If this was the only way Kiva knew how to keep the rebel queen alive, when Kiva survived the trial by air, then Tilda would have more time to recover, and Kiva would have bought more time for the rebels to come for her, for both of them. If Kiva did die today, the dead didn't suffer the censure of the living. Tilda's fate would no longer be her responsibility. So be it, the captain said when she remained silent. Though he seemed displeased, Kiva wondered if he knew who she was. if he remembered her, but then she realized he wouldn't be treating her much differently if that were true. It's all right. Everything will be all right. Kiva breathed deeply through her nose and forced the memory away again. Kiva Meriden, called the amplified voice of the Crown Prince, prompting both her and the captain to look down from the watchtower balcony. You have volunteered to undertake the trial by ordeal in place of the accused rebel queen. Today you shall face the trial by air. Do you have any last words? Kiva had many, none of which would allow her to live if she managed to survive the trial. So she held her tongue and shook her head. She didn't dare look towards where she'd last seen Tip, Jaren, Tilda, and Nari, nor did she look for Mott or any other familiar faces in the crowd, lest she lose her nerve. Very well, Prince Deverick said, elemental magic projecting his voice for all to hear. Kiva had never witnessed such power in effect before. Had this been any other time, she would have marvelled at it, and also at what the princess had done in relocating both Kiva and the captain onto the guard tower. Instead of being amazed, however, she was trying not to soil her pants as she waited to hear what was ahead. She would be all right, she reminded herself. She would survive. She would. Captain Varys, Prince Deverick continued, would you be so kind as to explain the first ordeal to the champion? Kiva swivered back to the captain and willed him to assume she was this pale all the time. The trial by air is straightforward, Varys said. You're to jump from here, he pointed at the slatted floor upon which they stood, to there. Kiva followed his finger with her eyes, her head spinning as she marked her destination, the top of the eastern wall, 30 feet away. That's impossible, Kiva choked out around her constricted throat, her confidence vanishing in an instant. It's not meant to be easy, Varys said without pity. Even if the tower were closer to the wall, it would still be a challenging jump, but with so much distance between them, including a bottleneck of onlookers below. An incredulous laugh left Kiva, so much for the first trial being survivable. Regret crept along her spine, mixed liberally with panic, leaving chills in its wake. As far as records go, Captain Varys said conversationally, the furthest anyone has been reported to have jumped in a single leap was just over 29 feet. This is barely more than that. On the ground, Kiva rasped out, and I'm guessing that was with a running start. Varys remained unmoved. You can jump, or I can push you. The choice is yours. Kiva wanted to tell him exactly what he could do with his choice. Instead, she took a deep breath and stepped closer to the edge of the balcony, placing her hands on the rickety wooden railing to look over the side and gauge the distance to the earth. She pulled back again immediately as vertigo took hold. I can't. You can't. It's not. Kiva couldn't even get a sentence out. She inhaled again, attempting to calm her rising hysteria. We don't have all day, came the prince's amplified voice, impatience threading his tone. You have 30 seconds, champion, or we'll consider you to have surrendered. Lights flashed in Kiva's vision. Surrendering meant failing, and failing meant both she and Tilda would lose their lives. Tip at least should be safe, since he'd no longer provide any leverage, but who would protect him once Kiva was gone? Instead of adding to her terror, the thought steadied her. Sudden clarity made her realize that it was better to lose her life by trying to save it than to doom them all with her cowardly inaction. Time. That was all she needed. Time. If she could somehow pull off a miracle, somehow survive this task, her freedom could be only a leap away. Sucking in one last calm breath, Kiva summoned her courage and pointed at the railing. Open this. Captain Varys didn't reprimand her for the command, perhaps thinking it was the last she would ever give. He snapped his fingers, and 2 guards from within the tower hurried out and undid the latch of the corner of the barrier, swinging it into the open air. 20 seconds, champion, came the prince's bored voice. Kiva toed the edge of the balcony, making herself look down this time. She could see the royals and Rook standing on the gallows platform beneath her, the crowd of prisoners looking up with anticipation gleaming on their faces. Entertained. They were all entertained. Her life, or death, being nothing but a spectacle to them. 10 seconds and you'll have failed, the prince declared. Kiva closed her eyes, blocking out the view of all those watching, waiting. 9, the crowd below cried. She started backing up. 8, step after step after step. 7. She was aware of Captain Verus shuffling out of her way, the other guards remaining on the balcony to watch. 6. She continued backwards. Step. 5. After step. 4. After step. 3. Until she was at the furthest point from the opened edge. 2 seconds champion warned the prince. Don't let her die. Stay alive. Kiva's mind went blank and she shot forward, her entire focus on the task before her. She willed strength into her legs, lightness into her body, air into every atom of her being as she sprinted along the tower and gave a mighty leap off the side. Stay alive. We are coming. Icy wind bit at her skin and tugged at her clothes, and she speared through the air. She was doing it. She was actually doing it. The wall was nearing with every racing heartbeat, her pulse thumping so loudly that it nearly drowned out the raging whoosh of air past her ears. Closer and closer she soared, defying gravity itself, the top of the eastern wall approaching with every microsecond that passed. She was going to make it. She was going to beat the odds, to succeed against the first ordeal. Triumph raged within her. She could almost feel the solid wall beneath her. She could almost taste victory. But then she was falling. So close. She was so close. If she could only reach out and grab hold of the edge, then she'd be able to... But it was too late. She was already plummeting down, down, down to the earth. It was all right. Everything will be all right. Her father's voice echoed in her ears, and this time she didn't push it away. She wanted him with her as she fell, needed his comfort as she met her end. It's all right. Everything will be all right. Kiva closed her eyes, unwilling to watch the inevitable play out. She kept them closed and thought of her father, of what happened the day her life was taken from her. She'd been on borrowed time for 10 years, and today that time had come to an end. It's all right. Everything will be all right. Suddenly the whoosh in her ears stopped. The icy wind disappeared, and then pain, blinding, overwhelming pain, lanced through every inch of Kiva's body, and then she knew no more. Well, the end. She's dead. No, not really. She's not really dead. Oh, nice. That bought 10. So. Okay, chapter 12. It's alright. Everything will be alright. Kiva didn't let go of her father's hand as the royal guard surrounded them, nor did she release her brother's hand on her other side. The sweet aroma of jerry berries teased her nostrils as the nearest soldiers trampled the basket she and Karen had collected. All of their hard work squashed into the mud. Their mother wouldn't be making her jam tonight. Not anymore. Farron Meriden, you're under arrest, declared the guard who had stopped directly in front of Kiva's father. He had a kind face, Kiva thought, so she couldn't understand why he looked so angry. The golden crest over his heart was different from those of the other soldiers, all of whom bore only a silver emblem. For what crime? Farron demanded. Kiva looked up at her father, hearing a strange emotion in his voice. It was like when she and Karen had played in the river last summer and tried to see who could swim the deepest and hold their breath the longest. Kiva had won by far, but when she'd returned to the surface, her father had been shaking and told her to never stay under the water for so long, ever again. That same tone was in his voice now, his trembling hand clutching hers as if to steady them both. She gripped him tighter, letting him know she was there. When the soldiers had poured down from their cottage to surround them, he'd said everything would be all right. Kiva believed him, knowing he would never lie to her. You were spotted in the marketplace with a known rebel, the gold-crested guard answered. You're to be imprisoned for suspected treason against the crown. For a long moment, Kiva's father appeared unable to speak, his face as white as the moon, slowly rising overhead. Farron squared his shoulders and tried again. The marketplace is full of people. I could have brushed shoulders with any number of rebels without knowing. I could have treated them. For all I know, I'm a healer. People come to me from all walks of life, and I don't ask questions before helping them. Maybe you should, the guard said emotionlessly. Step away from your children and come willingly, or we'll take you by force. Farron's grip turned crushing. A squeak of fear left Kiva, and a louder gasp came from her brother. She turned to Karen, seeing the silver jerry berry smears around his mouth, and his widened emerald eyes, the exact same shade as hers. He was trembling beside her, and despite her father's grip beginning to hurt, she was careful to give her younger brother's sticky fingers a gentle calming squeeze. You can't take me from my family, Farron said. The rest of your family has already fled, the guard said, pointing an armoured hand up the hill to the cottage where Skievers' mother and older siblings had last been. Smoke was beginning to curl from their home, a flickering orange glow bleeding from the windows into the night. You should thank the Everworld that we want you badly enough not to chase them, or they'd be heading to Zalandov with you. Zalandov? Farron swayed on his feet, prompting Kiva to strengthen her hold on him, their palms slick with sweat despite the wintry air. You can't send me to... Enough, the gold-crested guard interrupted. He looked toward the two nearest soldiers and ordered, "Take him." These two clipped words loosened Kiva's tongue, and her panic. "No," she cried, holding her father even tighter. "Papa!" Karen screamed. The soldiers raised their drawn swords and marched forward, closing the space between them. Farron wrenched his hand from Kiva, shoving her away with enough force that she went back 3 steps before losing her balance and falling to the ground. Karen should have fallen with her, but his very slicked fingers slipped from hers as he leapt away, not toward their father, but to the dagger Farron had been using to cut his supply of aloeweed. "Karen, don't!" Kiva yelled. Karen didn't hear her, didn't listen. Instead, the young boy scooped up the blade and with a roar launched himself toward the approaching guards. It happened in an instant, so fast from her position on the ground, Kiva didn't see it, didn't realize until it was too late. One moment, Karen was barreling forward. The next, he was dropping to the ground, clutching at his chest and at the sword that was embedded there. Years passed in the time it took for the soldier to withdraw his blade, for the sickening squelch of steel moving through flesh and bone to fade, for all those watching to fully comprehend what had happened. "No," howled Farron, falling to his knees beside his son and pressing his hands to the boy's small chest. "No, no, no." "Karen," Kiva whispered, tears flooding her eyes. She scrambled through the mud toward them, berry juice staining her hands, her knees, her clothes. "Karen, somebody get me. Farron couldn't finish. His choked command, for there was nothing anyone could get him. No remedy that could help him. Nothing anyone could do as Karen's eyes rolled into the back of his head. "No," Kiva said, reaching her sticky hand toward him. "No, Karen, no." Before she could press her fingers into his wound, just like her father, before she could so much as touch him, a steely arm bended around her waist, hoisting her up into the air. "This wasn't meant to happen," growled a voice in her ear, the man with the golden crest. "This never should have happened." "Let me go!" Kiva screamed, kicking at him, tears pouring from her eyes. "Let me! I need to! You have to!" "Get him up," the guard commanded, the soldiers bearing down on Farron. The one whose blade was dripping with Karen's blood stood immobile over him, his young face ashy, until his companions pushed him to the side. Only then did he return to himself, wiping his sword and advancing with the others. "We've got our orders." "Papa," Kiva sobbed, still kicking at the guard, but his grip was unyielding. "Papa!" Farron might as well have been as lifeless as his youngest son, for all that he reacted to her pleas. He did not fight, did not struggle at all as the guards heaved him up and began to drag him away. "Papa!" Kiva screamed again. "Bury the boy." The man holding her ordered his remaining soldiers. In a quieter, raspier voice, he added, "But have care, he's just a child." As the guards moved to collect Karen, Kiva wrestled even more fiercely against her captor. "Don't touch him," she screamed. "Don't you dare! I'm sorry about this, girl," the man holding her murmured, "but you brought this on yourself." "Let me go," Kiva choked out between sobs. "Papa! But swift pain cut off her mid-cry, and then darkness flooded her vision, with her world and her life disappearing in an instant. "I don't have all day, healer. Wake up." A rough shake had Kiva's eyes shooting open. prompting her to sit up with a gasp that turned into a coughing fit. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't draw air into her lungs. She couldn't... Oh, stop being so dramatic, said a haughty female voice moments before a hand came down on Kiva's back, thumping hard. Hacking and gagging, Kiva tried to shove her assailant away, but her attempt was weak. Pain lashed up her arms, down her legs, through her stomach. She felt bruised all over, like someone had come along with a meat cleaver and smashed it into her 1,000 times. For Everwald's sake, just breathe like a normal person, commanded the person still hitting her back. It's not that hard. Slowly Kiva was able to stop coughing, though every part of her still ached. Tears streamed from her eyes at the effort it had taken to fill her lungs, and she raised a shaking hand to clear her blurry vision. When she was finally able to blink her way to clarity, she sucked in a breath so sharp that she nearly started coughing all over again. "Your Highness," Kiva gasped out at the sight of the masked princess sitting on the stool beside her bed in the infirmary. "What are you—" "Drink this before you start dying again," Princess Mirren interrupted, shoving a small stone tumbler toward Kiva. It was only a quarter full, and Kiva didn't need to give the white liquid a sniff to identify it as poppy milk. Normally she wouldn't want anything hindering her lucidity, especially in the presence of Avalon royalty, but she could barely think, let alone speak, over the pain raging through her body. Downing the nutty-flavoured remedy in one go, Kiva was grateful that the princess allowed her a few moments for it to take effect. The dose wasn't large enough to knock her out, or even make her high, but it swiftly eased her pain into a dull background thrum. "Better?" Princess Mirren asked. "Much," Kiva said. She forced herself to add, "Thank you." Carefully, very carefully, Kiva shifted her pillow and leaned back against the wall, wincing slightly and wishing she'd ingested more poppy milk before moving. But she had more support now, and after a few steadying breaths, her pain was manageable once again. "So should I, Kiva made a gesture with her hands to indicate bowing. Mirren snorted. "I'd like to see you try." Kiva took that to mean the princess wouldn't punish her for her lack of royal etiquette. "I guess you're wondering why I'm here," Mirren said, taking the tumbler from Kiva and turning it between her fingers as if she needed something to do with her hands. Kiva considered the question and slowly replied, "To be honest, I'm wondering why I'm here." With the poppy milk taking effect and her attention moving beyond her physical distress, she couldn't reconcile what she remembered happening with the trial by air and her current state. "I fell," Kiva continued. "I should be dead." "Yes," Mirren answered, "you should be." The princess said no more, and while Kiva was bursting with questions, she held her tongue and waited. She used the silence to look around the infirmary, noting that the crown prince wasn't with his sister. She did, however, see that the drapes were drawn around a bed in the corner, Tilda's bed. So she made the hopeful assumption that Jaren and Tip had returned the sick woman after the ordeal had ended. Neither of the boys were in the room, but Captain Vera stood at the entrance to the infirmary, his alert eyes moving from the princess to Kiva and then out to the grounds. No other guards were present, royal or otherwise. Seeing the captain, Kiva's aching stomach tensed. The memory of the first time she'd crossed paths with him still fresh in her mind. She could still remember the feel of him hoisting her into his arms, his grip unyielding, as she'd fought with all her strength to be free. She could still remember how he'd been there on the day her brother's life had ended, the day her life had ended, in a different way. Swallowing, Kiva turned back to find the princess studying her. She knew she shouldn't look away, should show some reverence, but she didn't have it in her. Uncowed, she held Mirren's stare, the princess's mask doing nothing to hide the intrigue in her blue gaze. "You would have done it," Mirren finally said. "You would have died for her." "Technically, I would have died with her," Kiva said. "I die, she dies, remember?" "And you live, she lives," the princess returned. "If you survive the next 3 ordeals, you'll be free, the most wanted woman in the kingdom." "That's a big if, enough if, that I don't think you need to be worrying about it right now." "Easy for you to say," Mirren returned. "It's not your crown she's trying to steal." "Have you seen her?" Kiva jerked her head toward the closed curtain. "She won't be stealing anything anytime soon." Kiva knew she should be more careful, but she couldn't bring herself to guard her words, not even as the princess's eyes narrowed behind her mask. Resisting the urge to backpedal and blame the poppy milk for her candour, Kiva lifted her chin and kept her gaze steady on the princess, unblinking. She wished someone else had been with her upon waking. Tip, Mott, Jaren, even Nari or the warden, someone to whom she could ask her questions. But since only Mirren was here, she would have to do. How did I survive the trial? Kiva asked straight out. She was too tired and sore to talk in circles. Mirren placed the tumbler on the bedside table, Kiva's bed, her fingers moving to fiddle with the embroidered edges of her red cloak. You remind me of my girlfriend. She never would have let me hear the end of it. If she'd learned that you died today, someone with your spirit should be given a fighting chance. That's what she would have told me. Kiva's world tilted. You saved me? Mirren snorted. Gosh, no. Why would I care what happens to you? Brushing invisible lint from her shoulder, she went on. My idiot brother, however, she rolled her eyes. It seems even crowned princes can be swayed by a pretty face. Who needs justice when attraction is clearly much more important? Wait, Prince Deverick saved me? Kiva's mind continued spinning. Mirren's pale eyebrows arched over the top of her mask. You fell 50 feet from that tower. It's not as if you survived on your own. Kiva couldn't form a sentence, given all she knew of the Valentis family. How they were the very reason she was in Zalandov to begin with. She couldn't wrap her brain around this unlikely truth. But why? The princess made an impatient sound. I just told you. Aren't you listening? She stopped fiddling and crossed her arms. Never mind. Just be grateful that you're alive. Kiva shifted in her bed, grimacing anew at the pain, and couldn't keep from muttering, barely. Excuse me? Mirren's second brow rose to meet the first. I said, barely, Kiva repeated. I feel like I've broken every bone in my body. A surprised laugh left the princess. Is that the thanks my brother gets for saving your life? He's not here right now. No, but I am, said Mirren, a dangerous edge creeping into her voice, and you'd do well to show some respect. Kiva sobered, reminding herself of whom she was talking with. The drug was affecting her more than she'd thought. If she was deliberately antagonizing one of the most powerful people in the kingdom, not to mention the princess was right, Princess Deverick had saved her, even if it was only for superficial reasons. I apologize, Your Highness. She forced out, the words like hot coals on her tongue. Please pass along my gratitude to your brother. Mirren sat back, her blue eyes slitted. A long moment of silence passed before she said, I'm disappointed. I expected more of a fight. Kiva's forehead crinkled. You want me to be difficult? I want you to show that backbone I saw when you leapt up onto the gallows, Mirren said. I want you to show the courage it took to jump off the guard tower. I want you to show the spirit my girlfriend would have cheered you on for, the spirit my brother kept you alive for. You said it was my face that made him save me, Kiva deadpanned. I also said he's an idiot. You claimed I had a death wish, Kiva reminded. Twice. And look at you now, alive and well. Mirren shot back. Only because of your brother, Kiva said, accusation and confusion in her tone. Does it even count as victory over the ordeal? Will I have to... Princess Mirren waved a hand, cutting Kiva off. You completed the trial in the eyes of the Lord. In the eyes of the law. You survived. That's what counts. When Kiva opened her mouth to argue, Mirren sent her a sharp look and said, Don't start. I've already had to sit through a lecture about interference, even though I wasn't the one who acted rashly. But of course I had to be dragged into this, didn't I? As Mirren continued to mutter angrily under her breath, Kiva looked around the empty infirmary again. Where is Prince Deverick? Why isn't he here? The princess laughed, an open, deeply amused sound. That is an excellent question. My brother is a reckless, impulsive fool, yet he still manages to be one of the best people I know. He's probably out befriending criminals as we speak, forging lifelong connections. Slyly, Mirren continued. He's quite taken with you, you know, if it wasn't already obvious by you still being alive right now. Warmth touched Kiva's cheeks as she recalled the prince declaring, I like her, in front of the assembled masses, hoping to keep the prince's princess from noticing, Kiva asked, "A person who lectured you, do you mean Captain Varys?" The guard in question flicked his eyes over at the sound of his name, but otherwise didn't move from his position, his face expressionless. Mirren laughed again. "Varys is a big softy. I'm surprised he didn't leap off the tower and catch you himself." Kiva said nothing, fearing what might leave her mouth if she opened it, fearing what she might reveal of her first encounter with the man and all that he had taken from her, all in the name of the Valentis family, Mirren's family. The family that Kiva hated and would hate for as long as she lived. No, it was Warden Rook who had some choice words for me and my brother, Mirren explained. Kiva would have given a lot to know what those words were. To anyone not of royal blood, interfering with a trial would have meant severe punishment, imprisonment, perhaps even death. But a prince, and the heir to the throne at that, Kiva doubted she would be carving Deverick's flesh any time soon. Not even if she'd had a run-in with Rook. The warden emphasized his displeasure at my brother's actions and made it clear that we are discouraged from attending the next 3 trials, Mirren said. "Between you and me, that's no great tragedy." She sniffed and wrinkled her nose, as if the very air offended her. The fact that Rook had chastised the prince and princess didn't surprise Kiva, nor did their capitulation to his request, since the last thing the Avalon royals would want was to get on the wrong side of the man who kept their greatest enemies locked away. "Why are you here, princess?" Kiva finally asked, needing answers, especially after learning that the royals had been given marching orders by Rook. There was no reason why Mirren should be in the infirmary, or why a princess would deign to waste time speaking with a prisoner. "Your brother saved me for whatever ridiculous reason he told you, and I'm thankful, really I am, but that doesn't explain why you were waiting by my bedside for me to wake up. What aren't you telling me?" The princess raised her hand, and Kiva flinched backwards, an automatic defensive response. Mirren's eyes flickered behind her mask, and she said nothing, instead slowly closing her hand into a fist. As she did so, the air around them rippled, and Kiva's ears popped as pressure pushed against her head feeling like it was being stuffed with cotton wool. "I placed us in an air pocket," Mirren said, "for privacy." She nodded toward Varys, who was looking out at the grounds, now oblivious to their ongoing conversation. Marveling at what the princess had done, Kiva tried to yawn away the pressure, but the discomforting sensation didn't yield. "We won't have much time before he wonders why we're so quiet and realizes what I've done," the princess continued, a hint of urgency in her smooth, cultured voice. "Tell me how confident you are that you can survive the next 3 ordeals." Kiva was surprised enough that she stopped attempting to yawn, making herself ignore the strange feeling of the air pocket. "I think the better question is how unconfident I am. I'm being serious, healer." "As am I, princess," Kiva shot back. "No one has ever survived all 4 before." She wasn't about to admit that her hopes that she wouldn't have to undertake the remaining trials, that her family would come back for her before then. Mirren shook her head. "Not true. Long ago people survived." Kiva made a scoffing sound, the puppy milk overriding her self-preservation instincts. "Sure, back when people had magic. Sorry to disappoint you, but unless I'm your long-lost sister, I don't have a lick of elemental power in my veins." "So you need to use your other skills," Mirren said, growing frustrated. "What can you do?" Kiva threw out her arms, instantly regretting the move for the surge of pain it prompted. "Look around you. This is what I can do. I heal people, that's it." "Then you're gonna die." 5 words, and Kiva's breath froze in her lungs. Mirren settled back in her seat, her face impassive, despite the death sentence she'd just delivered. "It's true, you know it is," the princess said coldly, "and while you might not deserve such an end, everyone certainly believes she does." Mirren jabbed an elegant finger toward Tilda's closed curtain. Kiva swallowed. "You're going to die," Mirren repeated, "and so will she." The princess sent her a ruthless look, and quite frankly, it'd be much less of a headache for us all if you did. Kiva sucked in a breath, but Mirren wasn't done speaking. "But," the princess said, before sighing long and loud, "it seems I'm too magnanimous for my own good." Brow crinkling, Kiva asked, "What? Mirren sighed again, then said, Warden Rook said you've been here 10 years. You're a survivor, Kiva Meriden, and if you can last that long, you can make it through another 6 weeks, especially if you have help. Kiva was struggling to keep up with what was happening, the painkillers making her mind slower than normal. It sounded as if... Here, Mirren said, thrusting a hand into her cloak, and after a quick glance toward the still oblivious Varys, withdrawing a shiny amulet. Kiva took it when prompted and turned it between her fingers. Upon realizing what it was, she debated whether the poppy milk was a good enough excuse to get away with throwing it back at the princess's face. At the end of the glittery chain was a perfect depiction of the Valentis crest. The sword, arrow, crown, and 4 quadrants were solid gold, but the elemental representations were made from coloured gemstones: sapphire for water, emerald for earth, topaz for air, and ruby for fire. It was beautiful. But it represented everything. Everything Kiva hated. Very pretty, she bit out as she shoved it back toward the princess. Mirren didn't take it. Instead, she said, Most of my family has just one elemental affinity, but I'm gifted with 2. Air, as you already know. She paused, as if to make sure Kiva was paying attention. And fire. With another quick glance at Captain Varys, Mirren turned back to Kiva and opened her palm. A flame appeared above her head. No, not above her hand. On her hand. Sorry, a flame appeared above her hand. No, not above her hand. On her hand. It surrounded her flesh, the fire dancing over her skin as she moved her wrist this way and that, the embers beginning to wander along her forearm before she snapped her fingers and made it all disappear. Her skin was unblemished, her cloak sleeve, while slightly charred, was otherwise undamaged. Impressive, Kiva choked out when she saw the princess was waiting for a reaction. Mirren smirked and nodded toward the amulet still in Kiva's hand. The ruby in the crest can absorb fire magic, should someone, such as myself, push power into it. Her smirk widened, her implication clear. I don't know what the trial by fire is, but as long as you're wearing that, she indicated the amulet again, then the magic within should keep you protected. Kiva gaped at the princess, then at the amulet, struck, speechless. Don't let anyone see it, or they'll think you stole it, Mirren warned. She paused, then added, My charity only extends so far. You'll have to figure something else for the last 2 trials. Kiva nodded mutely, still unable to form a response. She did, however, close her fingers around the amulet and tuck it into the folds of her blanket, hidden from sight. The moment it was covered, Mirren raised her hand, repeating the action that had created the air pocket. Kiva's ears popped again, this time with relief, as the pressure lifted, and she knew they were no longer in their privacy bubble. It was an experience to meet you, healer, the princess said, standing to her feet and smoothing invisible wrinkles from her cloak. I'll look forward to hearing news of how you fare in the rest of your trials, whatever your fate may be. Mirren didn't offer any words of encouragement or well wishes for Kiva's survival. In fact, as she began to walk away, she seemed quite content to purge Zalandor and its inhabitants from her mind, the prison healer included. And yet Kiva couldn't keep from calling out to her, finally able to speak. Wait. The princess halted, half turning back to her. Why are you helping me? Kiva asked, the amulet all but burning beneath her blanket. You said earlier that you don't care what happens to me. I don't understand, she swallowed, then made herself add, If I live, so does Tilda. Why would you risk that? Later, when the poppy milk left her system, Kiva might wonder at her own daring, but now she needed answers. Whether Mirren knew it or not, the Valentis family was the reason Kiva was in this mess at all. Suspected treason against the crown. That was why Kiva Meriden had been arrested. No proof, no nefarious plotting or actions. He'd merely been seen in a public marketplace near the wrong person at the wrong time. His supposed crime had landed him at Zalandor's, and Kiva with him. They were both victims of circumstance, with Karen nothing more than collateral damage. Kiva had spent 10 years coming to terms with that night, learning to accept that stewing on what had happened to her family would not keep her alive. The injustice of it all tasted bitter in her mouth, but she was able to push past it to focus on what was more important, surviving. Because of that, she was rational enough to know that if she wasn't rescued before the next trial, then the princess had just given her an invaluable treasure, safe passage through to the third ordeal. But Kiva didn't know why. Turning to face her more fully, Mirren eyed Kiva, weighing her response. Finally, the princess answered, "Part of it is because my brother has a soft heart. Too soft, if you ask me. Especially for a crown prince." Mirren rolled her eyes behind her mask. "But lustful idiot or not, I owed him a favour." Lustful idiot indeed. Kiva had no idea what Prince Deverick was thinking. While grateful she'd never asked for his help, and given that he was a Valentis, she had no intention of repaying him. Ever. "As for the other part," the princess went on, "you have the spirit of a survivor, and I can't help respecting that. In any other circumstance, I think you and I might have grown close, become friends even." Kiva sucked in a startled breath. It was that, or start laughing. Protective amulet or not, there was no way she would ever. "But this isn't any other circumstance," Mirren continued, cutting off Kiva's inner denial. "And the truth is, even with my help, I'm assuming you'll still fail. That's why I'm giving you a chance, albeit a hopeless one." She shrugged an unapologetic rise and fall of her shoulders. "The likelihood of you and Tilda surviving the next 6 weeks on your own, of Tilda even living long enough given her sickness, well, you don't need to tell me the odds. You don't need me to tell you the odds." It was true, Kiva already knew. She was just banking on something the princess didn't know, or someone, multiple someones, her family, and the rebels. "Stay alive. Don't let her die. We are coming." "I've always rooted for the underdog," Mirren said, almost musingly. "And you, Kiva Meriden, are the biggest underdog I've ever seen." "I have to agree with you on that one," interrupted a new voice. Kiva could do nothing but stare as the Crown Prince himself strode into the infirmary, his shoulders back, head held high, winter cloak rippling dramatically behind him as he approached on calm, unhurried feet. "Finally," Mirren said to him. "Apologies, dearest Miri, I've been busy," the prince said. "There are so many interesting people here, such fascinating stories." The way Deverick looked at Mirren made Kiva think they were communicating without words, and she felt a pang, having had entire silent conversations with her own siblings once upon a time. "Well, hello there, gorgeous," the prince said, coming to a halt at Kiva's bedside. He grinned down at her, a flash of perfect teeth. His mask hid everything but his mouth and his cobalt eyes, which were dancing with what looked like amusement. "You're looking well," he winked. "Very well." Kiva wondered if he thought himself charming. For her part, she was unimpressed, and entirely uninterested. Impulsive and reckless, Mirren had called him. Apparently he was a bit of a cad. Not that Kiva hadn't guessed as much, given that he'd saved her life on the basis of her appearance. Still, she wasn't about to look a gift horse in the mouth, even if that horse was coated in slime. "Your Highness," she returned stiffly, "thank you for saving me." Prince Deverick waved a hand, still grinning. "It was nothing, really." "The healer had some complaints about her physical condition," Mirren told her brother, inspecting her fingernails. "Consider yourself lucky to have received any gratitude at all." Kiva's eyes widened. "I'll admit the timing was close," the prince acknowledged. "Another few seconds and—" He made a slapping sound with his hands, enough to turn Kiva's stomach. "But you're alive, and that's what matters. It'd be a shame for someone as lovely as you to— Gosh, spare me." Mirren groaned, her features pinched. "Can we go now? I need to bathe for the next 100 years. I fear I'll never get the stench of this place off me." "The People's Princess," Deverick said to Kiva, his tone wry. "Patient, long-suffering, full of joy, abounding with love and kindness, and—" "Oh, shut up," Mirren said, reaching for her brother's arm and dragging him away from Kiva's bedside. "You do so love to hear your own voice." "It is a very nice voice," the prince said. "Don't you think, Kiva?" Kiva jolted at the sound of her name falling from his lips. It was startling how casually he'd used it, as if they'd known each other for years. She said nothing, which only made his smile grow wider. "I've enjoyed this," he said, even as his sister continued pushing him from the room. I hope our paths cross again one day, champion. And then Mirren shoved him past Captain Varys and out the door, pausing only to straighten her cloak and call back to Kiva. I still think you have a death wish. Feel free to prove me wrong. That was a long chapter. I needed that drink, I tell you now, and I have like 1 billion cookies. Yep, time for the time machines. Yep, 7. And those for unknown, so when I get to 4 billion. Many cookies, I know, right? Oatmeal raisin cookies, maybe I should save up to upgrade my cookies. Sorry, yes, I needed another drink. Oh, look, that's a golden cookie, Shaggy! Plus 4.477 million cookies. Cookie vortex, eh? Cookie vortex. Bake 1 million cookies per second. Phew, are these the clicker ones? I wish it was the bonus though. Like, I wish it was the bonus rather than just random number of cookies. Could you imagine? Could you imagine how many cookies I would have got? Oh, 99. 99. 100. Nice. It's crazy when like all these things that were like so expensive are now cheaper than the cursor. Excuse my little hiccup there. 77. 78. 79. One more. And 80. Alright. Here we go again. Good old chocolate milk. Chalky milk. Right, chapter 13. After the royals left the infirmary, Kiva tried to get out of bed, but her aching body wasn't up to the task. Instead, she tossed and turned until even that caused her too much pain. So she lay there, thinking about all that had happened that day, before the poppy milk finally swept her back to sleep. When she awoke again, the infirmary was much darker, and low-lit luminum beacons chasing away the worst of the night's shadows, and revealing that she wasn't alone. "What are you doing here?" Kiva croaked, her voice raspy from sleep. Jaren was sitting on a stool beside her bed, looking down at his hands, but his head shot up at her question, relief flooding his features. "Why do you always ask me that?" "Maybe it's because I'm constantly surprised to see you're still alive. The same could be said about you after the stunt you pulled today." Kiva didn't want to have this conversation while lying horizontal. She didn't want to have this conversation at all, but definitely not in such a vulnerable position. Pushing herself up, she held in her grimace as pain shot through her arms, torso, and head all at once. Then she carefully assumed the same position as she had with the princess, leaning back against the wall. That looked painful. Kiva sent a glare toward Jaren. Looks can be deceiving. She didn't know why she was so defensive around him, why she hated revealing any sign of weakness. Jaron sighed and ran his hands through his hair. It was sticking out at odd angles, as if he'd repeated that action numerous times. Peering closer, Kiva noted that he was covered in even more dirt and grime than when she'd seen him out by the gallows, indicating that he'd been laboured hard in the tunnels before and afterward. There were shadows under his eyes and weariness about the way he held himself. Zalandorf was getting to him, she could tell, even if it hadn't yet broken him. Is there something I can get you? Jaron asked quietly, recalling his strong aversion to pain-relieving drugs. Kiva shook her head, deciding to wait until he left before she took another dose of poppy milk. That, and she didn't want to risk muddying her wits while in his presence. I'm fine, Kiva said. Now answer me, why are you here? Jaron uttered a disbelieving sound. Why do you think? He jabbed a finger toward her and said with clear accusation. You nearly died today, Kiva. So what? The two words slipped from her mouth before she could stop them. So what? He repeated, incredulous. So what? Are you kidding me? She said nothing, startled by his fierce reaction. Did you want to die? He demanded. Was that your plan? Kiva jerked backwards. Of course not, she said vaguely, aware of the door to the quarantine room opening and closing, but she didn't take her eyes from Jaron. Then why, Kiva? Why would you sacrifice yourself like that? Why risk your life for some woman you don't even know? He pointed sharply toward the closed privacy curtain around Tilda's bed. Why give up everything for her? Why do you care, Jaron? Kiva shot back at him. You don't know me well enough to be this upset. No, but I do. Kiva ignored Jaron's hurt face and turned to find Tip standing at the quarantine door. At the sight of the tears in his eyes, she instantly deflated. Tip, why did you do it, Kiva? He asked in a trembling voice, his freckles stark against his pale face. You told me no one can survive the trials, that they're a death sentence. Tip, come here, Kiva said, reaching out her hand. It was shaking slightly, both from this confrontation and also from pain. Prince Devrick might have slowed Kiva's descent enough to keep her from dying, but he hadn't been gentle about it. Slowly, Tip approached, tears still pooling in his eyes. As he looked at her, why, Kiva? His throat bobbed. You told my mother you'd protect me. You can't do that if you're dead. While Kiva had no intention of telling Tip about Cresta's threat to his life, she still wished she could have this conversation alone with the boy. Sending a quick look toward Jaron, he only folded his arms and looked steadily back at her. Nari, too, was watching from just inside the entrance to the infirmary, the guard making no attempt to hide her eavesdropping. You're right, I did tell your mother that I'd look out for you, Kiva said quickly, taking Tip's hand in her own, and I plan to keep doing that long after these trials are over. When Tip turned his face away, Kiva squeezed his fingers to get his attention back and continued. Hey, I mean that. I've already made it through one ordeal. How hard can the other three be? She tried to infuse confidence into her voice, hiding all traces of doubt, while also taking care to conceal any hope that she might not have to face the remaining trials at all. Stay alive. Don't let her die. We are coming. But what then? Tip asked. You'll be free and I'll be alone. Kiva couldn't tell him the truth, nor could she tell him about her plan, not yet, not until she'd spoken with the warden. Even then she would remain quiet, for fear of getting Tip's hopes up in vain. There was a long road ahead, and Kiva had no guarantees it would end well, for any of them. Somewhat hoarsely she said, That's not a problem for today, so there's no point in worrying about it just yet. Then let's focus on today, Jaron cut in. You still haven't told us why you did what you did. Kiva had to count to 10 to stop from snapping that it was none of his business and requesting that he leave the infirmary. The truth was, she liked waking up to find him beside her bed. She liked that he was concerned, and that he cared enough to be angry. Very few people at Zalandorf gave any thought to her welfare. It was always she who was looking out for others, not the other way around. But she'd also meant what she said, that he didn't know her well enough to be so upset. She didn't understand what was happening between them and wondered if he just felt connected to her because she was the first person he'd met upon waking up at Zalandov. It wouldn't be the first time a prisoner reacted in such a way, even after she'd carved open their flesh. They perceived her as someone familiar during an uneasy transition into their new life, a comfort almost, but the dependence usually faded after a few weeks, and Kiva rarely interacted with them again unless they had a health concern or they turned up dead, and she had to send them to the morgue. Jaren, however, had already been at Zalandov for nearly 3.5 weeks, and showed no signs of disappearing from her life. If anything, it was the opposite, with her seeing more of him as time passed. Part of that was due to the bond he'd formed with Tip, the younger boy having adopted Jaren, deciding it was his purpose to help the newcomer survive. And Tip's connection to Kiva meant Jaren was, by mutual acquaintance, connected to her as well. But still, Kiva was out of her element with this and had no idea how to respond to his request. No, his demand for answers. While she had been at Zalandov long enough to know not to form any relationships, Tip was the only person Kiva allowed even remotely close to her heart, and she was determined to keep it that way. Nevertheless, seeing the concern on Jaren's face, the tears still in Tip's eyes, even the tight pinch to the listening Nari's features, Kiva couldn't muster the antipathy she required to keep from answering. "Help me up, would you?" she asked softly. "I want to show you something." While she would have preferred Tip's assistance, Jaren was more capable of supporting her, so she pushed aside her pride and allowed him to wrap his arm around her as she rose shakily to her feet. Kiva couldn't keep a quiet moan from leaving her lips as the bolts of electricity shot up her legs, hit her very nerves, up her legs, her very nerves protesting the move. While nothing was broken, it still felt like everything was. "You all right?" Jaren asked. She looked at him, realizing how close his face was to hers, his blue-gold eyes right there, and firmly told herself that she'd never live it down if she blushed while in his arms. "I already told you I'm fine." "You're not fine," he argued, his forehead creasing. "I don't need to be a healer to know that much." "Then why ask if I'm all right?" Kiva shot back, trying and failing to keep her temper in check. When she saw a muscle tick in his cheek, she blew out a breath and said more patiently, "I fell 50 feet, Jaren, and I'm alive, so I am fine, considering the alternative." She paused, then grudgingly admitted, "But I still feel like I fell 50 feet, so fine is relative." Jaren wrapped his arm more securely around her, pulling her deeper into his body as if to make absolutely sure she wouldn't hurt herself further. "The prince should have caught you sooner," he said tightly. Kiva didn't ask how he knew, guessing word had spread like wildfire around the prison. She only hoped he didn't know why the prince had saved her. She didn't need any more humiliation tonight. "He didn't have to catch me at all." Jaren's eyebrows rose. "You're defending—" "He's the reason I'm still here," Kiva cut in, though she was more surprised than anyone to hear the words coming from her lips. Never did she imagine that she would be defending a Valentis. "But what do you want to show us, Kiva?" Tip interrupted Jaren. "You shouldn't be out of bed for long." Kiva's heart warmed toward the boy, and she sent him a small smile. He didn't return it, still barely meeting her eyes. Sighing inwardly, Kiva said to Jaren, "Can you help me over to Tilda?" Jaren's lips pressed together, a clear sign of how he felt toward the other woman. But he did as Kiva requested, and helped her shuffle painfully across the room, where he drew back the curtain to reveal the sleeping rebel queen. Throughout all this, Kiva tried to ignore the firmness of his body, the reassurance of his strength supporting her. She wouldn't let herself be comforted by his touch, no matter how safe, how protected she felt in his arms. Pushing away from him to take a seat on the stool beside Tilda's bed, and breathing easier now that there was more space between them, Kiva waited until a Tip approached before she pointed at the woman and said, "When you look at her, what do you see? What does she represent?" Nari moved closer, as if not wanting to miss what Kiva was about to say. Kiva didn't pay her any mind. After having gone head-to-head with the Princess of Everlone, Avalon and then dealing with the rakish crown prince, the prison guard didn't seem so intimidating anymore. What could she do? Sentence Kiva to death? She was already facing that with the ordeals. There was little else left to fear. And besides, Nari had proved that she wasn't one of the gods whom Kiva needed to worry about. If the amber-eyed woman wanted to listen in, then so be it. What do you mean? Tip asked, brushing his red fringe from his eyes. It's just Tilda. Look closer, Kiva encouraged. Who is she? Tip looked confused. The rebel queen? Jaren's body turned solid, his eyes shooting from Kiva to Tilda and back again, as if wary of her answer, and slowly asked, Are you sympathetic to her cause? Is that why you saved her? Kiva weighed her response, thinking over her family's complicated history with the rebels, and where she fit into it, what she believed. With each second that passed, Jaren became more tense until Kiva said, I'm not some rebel underling, if that's what you're asking. Jaren visibly relaxed. That said, I'm not unsympathetic, Kiva admitted, causing him to turn rigid again. It was obvious where his own sentiments lay, given his outburst after Tilda's arrival. Kiva knew he was solidly in the anti-rebel camp. How can you... I've been in here long enough to hear both sides of the argument, Kiva interrupted him. You were all there the night we spoke to Avalon. We spoke of Avalon's history, how Torvin Quarantine and Serana Valentis became enemies, how the rebels were formed. As Mott said, they do have the right to the crown. Kiva looked down at Tilda and quietly added, She has a right to the crown, but... Once more, Kiva spoke over Jaren. Again, I'm not saying I'm a rebel. She wasn't about to admit her family's ties with them, or her hopes that Tilda's followers would save her from Zalandov. Best to give the answer that would ease his concerns, and Nari's, since the guard was just as tense. I was only 7 when I arrived here, remember? They were hardly going to try and recruit me before that, she offered a hint of a smile, urging the two of them to relax. If you're not with them, how can you be fine with what they're doing, with the unrest they're causing? Jaren asked, clearly frustrated. You've been in here for 10 years, so you don't know what it's like out there, how dangerous it is. Avalon is all but breaking apart. Most of the allied kingdoms have closed their borders, fearing the rebel movement will spread into their lands. In some, it already has, and our enemies, Karamor and Miraven, are frothing at the bit to launch an invasion, waiting for the slightest hint of weakness, if not for the Tenestra Mountains making it difficult for them to move their armies. He trailed off, shaking his head. Kiva smarted at the reminder of how little she knew about the outside world. The coded note she received didn't offer any political news, so the best she could hope for was when she treated new prisoners who happened to be talkative, or when Rook gave something away during their private meetings. But it wasn't Jaren's fault that she was so uninformed, so she forced patience into her tone and said, I'm not saying I support any of that. Just that I understand their motives, that they believe the kingdom is rightfully theirs and they want it back, but... She hurried on when Jaren opened his mouth again. In my experience, people who get mixed up with rebels usually end up imprisoned or dead. I'm already imprisoned. I don't want to be dead. I still don't. Let's not argue about this, Kiva cut Jaren off again. This was clearly something he was passionate about, enough that she wondered if he had a deeper, more personal reasons for being so opposed to the rebels. If he had family or friends who had been hurt, or worse, because of them, his reaction not only made sense, but was justified. While Kiva wouldn't be swayed from her own opinion, she didn't want to cause him further distress, so she went on. If you're still worried about where my loyalties lie, think of how useless I'd be to any of them, especially in here. She waved a hand, reminding him of where they are. Prison rebels actively despise me, so they're hardly going to ask for my aid. Ask, no. Threaten Tip's life, yes. But Kiva decided against mentioning that. Even outside of Zalandov, I'd be a terrible recruit. My healer code would mean I'd have to help anyone who came to me, including those loyal to the Valentis family. I doubt that would go over well with either side. Jaren's tension dissolved and his eyes finally lightened, as if he too realized just how preposterous such a circumstance would be. I still don't understand, Tip said, the emotion in his voice tugging at Kiva's heart. She had become distracted, seeking to keep Jaren and Nari from scrutinizing her motives, forgetting the reason she'd dragged them all over to Tilda's side and the explanation she'd intended to offer, misleading as it was. Turning to the young boy, Kiva said, I asked you what you think when you look at Tilda. You see a woman, rebel queen or otherwise. But I look at her and I see someone who is deathly ill and needs my help. Kiva returned her gaze to the bed, continuing to provide the only justification Tip would accept, with him having known her long enough to see it as truth. She represents everyone I've tried to save over the years. Everyone I've failed to save over the years. It's not just one life to me. It's all of them. And they all matter. She unconsciously rubbed her thigh, but then froze, pulling her hand into stillness. Neither Jaren nor Tip noticed, but Nari was watching her carefully enough that Kiva swallowed and avoided her observant eyes. So you see, she went on, I might not be able to keep everyone alive, but this woman, this patient, she shrugged carefully, it was in my power to do something. So I did. She offered what she hoped was a self-depreciating smile. Now we just have to wait and see if it'll make a difference. Kiva wasn't lying. She believed in them everything she'd said, but she couldn't tell them everything, couldn't share the real reason why she claimed Tilda's sentence, and not just because Nari was listening. Trusting wasn't something Kiva offered easily, especially in a place like Zalandold. So, you're saying you volunteered because she's sick? Tip asked, his young face puzzled. At least the tears were gone. Jaren and Nari looked skeptical, as if they knew there had to be more to it than that. Than what Kiva had said, but she avoided their eyes, determined to stick to her story. She would have died today, Kiva said, and I know it's irrational, that it's just a way of life, especially here, but I'm so tired of people dying on my watch. So yes, Tip, if I can save her life, or even just delay her death, then that's what I'm going to do, especially if it meant they could both walk free. The young boy sucked his lower lip between his teeth, gnawing on it as he finally considered her words. Finally, he said, then I guess we should to try harder to get her feeling better. That way she can thank you herself. Relief swept over Kiva, and it only grew stronger when Tip sent her a tooth-capped grin, tremulous as it was. She reached out to take his hand again, holding it tightly as she said just for him, I'm going to do everything I can not to leave you. Do you understand? I promised your mother, and I keep my promises. We're in this together, you and me. Kiva prayed that Rook would agree to what she had planned on asking him, even if it would only be valid in the worst-case scenario of her having to endure all three of the remaining ordeals. According to the law, they were to be held fortnightly, so she had 2 weeks before the next one. If her family and the rebels failed to arrive before then she was on her own. And if she didn't succeed, her death would leave Tip abandoned. Looking to Jaren, Kiva found his eyes already on her. She didn't shy away from his gaze, but instead tried to communicate everything she was thinking, everything she was feeling. If she died, she needed to know that someone would look out for Tip as long as possible. Jaren, to his credit, didn't fight her silent communication. His lips tightened and his expression intensified, as if willing her to not even consider her own demise, but when she continued looking at him calmly, pointedly, he blew out a breath and gave a terse nod of acceptance, of agreement. Feeling slightly unsettled that they'd just had a conversation without words, Kiva tore her eyes from him and leaned forward to place the back of her hand on Tilda's brow. Her fever hadn't returned, but she was restless, moaning in her sleep. Any change today? She asked, unable to keep from transitioning back into healer mode. Not with her, Tip said. There was a hesitant note to his voice, and Kiva glanced up at him as he continued. But the patients with the stomach virus are getting worse, and it's still spreading. The guards dragged in 3 more while you were sleeping. Sleeping was a very kind word for Kiva's state of unconsciousness. She turned toward the quarantine door, wondering if she had the strength to go and check on the sick prisoners herself. Don't even think about it. Kiva swiveled back to Jaren, noting his features as she pulled a face. Scrunch your nose at me all you want, but you're going straight back to bed, he told her. True to his threat, he wrapped his arm around her and gently eased her up to her feet. This time she bit her tongue to keep from moaning, but the look Jaren sent her made it clear that he knew she was muting her pain. The shuffle back to her pallet was more agonizing than she remembered the walk to Tilda being. And while she would never admit it, Jaren was right. There was no way she'd be able to stand long enough to look in on the sick patients. Thank you, she made herself say quietly when she was settled again. Her whole body was throbbing. But as she continued to give no outward indication, even so, she was hyper-aware that she must look as terrible as she felt. Jaren then strode away, heading toward the wooden cabinet at the end of the workbench on the far side of the room. Kiva shared a puzzled glance with Tip, who shrugged and fluffed her pillow behind her back. Neither had to wait long before Jaren returned to them with a stone tumbler in his hands. Drink, he said, passing it to Kiva. She blinked stupidly down at the white liquid. You got me poppy milk? She didn't phrase it as a question, but surprise caught her voice to trill upward at the end of her broken statement. Drink, Jaren said again. It'll help. But you don't... She trailed off, looking at him, trying to understand. His mouth twitched at the edges, and he shook his head as if finding her reaction amusing. Just because I don't like to take it doesn't mean others shouldn't. You said it yourself. You fell 50 feet today. If someone needs to be drugged, it's you. The dose he'd poured was more than what Mirren had given, half a tumbler's worth, definitely enough to knock her out. Frowning slightly, Kiva said, Just drink it, Kiva, Jaren said, albeit gently. He placed his hand over her free one, the calluses on his palm rough against her flesh, yet oddly comforting. They were the proof that he was surviving the tunnels, that he hadn't given up, unlike so many others. You need to rest. Alicia and Nurgle will be here soon, Tip said. I'll make sure they know about the new patients and promise to look after them. Sleep, Kiva. They can survive a night without you. The young boy leaned over and kissed her on the forehead before pointedly tapping his finger against her, holding the tumbler. Tip had never shied away from affection before, but the forehead kiss was something new. Blinking back tears at the tender gesture, Kiva raised the poppy milk and swallowed it down, handing the empty tumbler to Jaren. I'm sure I'll be back on my feet tomorrow, she told them, yawning as the drug began to take effect. And then we can figure out how to get you to the next ordeal, Tip said, tucking her in. Kiva didn't reply, only snuggled deeper into her bed, relieved when she felt the cool metal of the amulet still hidden beneath the blanket. If Princess Mirren was to be believed, Kiva didn't have to worry about the next ordeal. But the two after that... Not for the first time, Kiva wondered what she had been thinking, taking Tilda's place. She prayed that she was right about the coming rescue, but even if she was wrong, as her eyes closed and the poppy milk pulled her under, she couldn't bring herself to regret her actions. Not with the memory of Tip's forehead kiss on her brow. Sweet dreams, Kiva, Jaren's whisper came, as if from far away. A squeeze of his hand made her realize he was still holding hers, and that was the last she felt, the last she heard before she drifted off into blissful sleep. It was the dead of night when Kiva awoke next, sitting up with a startled squeak when she saw the shadow standing over her. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust to the low light of the infirmary, and when they did, her trepidation only increased when she recognized the looming figure. What in the name of the gods were you thinking? Warden Rook demanded, his hands fisted on his hips, his dark eyes flashing. Do you have any idea what you've done? He spat. Any idea how reckless, how foolish? Cresta was going to kill Tip, Kiva interrupted, unwilling to let Rook talk her down, not while the poppy milk was still in her system, giving her a hearty dose of courage. So, Rook threw his arms out. He's just one boy. Let him die. The thought made Kiva's blood turn cold. He's important to me. Then you're a fool, Rook said, pointing a finger at her, because what happens now? Even if you survive all the trials, which you won't, what then? You'll leave, and Tip will come with me. That brought the warden up short. He leaned back on his heels, squinting down at her. "I beg your pardon?" Kiva licked her lips, hoping she could pull this off. She wished her mind was less muddied from the medicine, and yet was simultaneously grateful for how bold it was making her. Never before had she felt so fearless in the warden's presence. "You told me that Tip could leave Zalendorf if he had a guardian on the outside to collect him," she said. "If I survive the trials and go free, I'll be his guardian. He'll leave with me." The warden said nothing for a long moment. Kiva shuffled painfully higher in her bed, her hands turning clammy as she waited for his answer. Finally, he spoke. "You have to survive the trials for that to happen." Kiva wanted to smile, to laugh, to get up and dance in celebration. Rook didn't argue, couldn't argue, since she'd used his own words against him. But still, she'd worried about him finding a loophole, some way of denying her claim. Instead, he'd only brought up the likelihood of her failure. That she could handle. "You're alive because I've protected you," Warden Rook hissed, the anger returning to his face. "You're alive because your father saved my life, and in return I promised I would keep an eye on you. How else do you think you've lasted so long?" Kiva recoiled at the mention of her father, but couldn't keep from answering somewhat bitterly. "Because people know I'm your informant, and since no one trusts me and everyone hates me, they leave me alone." "Wrong," Rook gritted through his teeth. Kiva had never seen so much emotion from the normally stoic man. "It's because everyone in here, inmates and guards, knows that if they lay a hand on you, they have to answer to me." Kiva nearly snorted. She'd been mistreated too many times to count over the years, especially by the guards. And then there was Cresta and her threat against Tip, something the warden didn't care a whit about. So much for the protection he claimed was upon her. Her perceived allegiance to him had brought Kiva nothing but trouble, along with the constant anxiety of having to deliver enough information to remain useful to him. But he was right in that nothing truly awful had ever happened to her, unlike what many of the other prisoners had endured, especially at the hands of the guards. She'd suspected that Rook's attentiveness acted like a warning to them. She'd just never considered if it was because he'd wanted to protect her, that he was repaying the debt he owed her father for saving him from a near-lethal case of sepsis almost a decade ago. Perhaps Rook did care about her in his own unconventional way. The thought sat strangely within her, as if she couldn't reconcile the idea of him keeping her alive while at the same time frequently threatening her with death. You couldn't have just let it lie, could you?" Rook finally said when Kiva remained silent. He sounded weary now, the anger bleeding from his voice. "If you hadn't interfered, Tilda Quarantine would have died today, and life would have gone back to normal. No more royal orders, no more sending updates about her condition, or answering demands about whether she's cognizant enough to communicate." Kiva bit her tongue to keep in a sarcastic reply about inconveniencing him. "Thanks to you, we have to see out the rest of the trials," Rook continued, "or as many as you can survive." His brow furrowed. "And when you fail, and you will fail, Kiva, you'll be leaving me without a competent prison healer." "You have Alicia and Nurgle," Kiva said, though her throat was tight at how easily he dismissed the thought of her surviving. Care was evidently too strong a word for what he felt toward her. Unconventional or not, she was just a tool to him, a healer, an informant. "And you've told me before, many times, that you can easily find a replacement for me." Sorry about that, I just had a tickle in my throat. "And you've told me before, many times, that you can easily find a replacement for me." Rook ran a hand over his short hair and ignored the accusation in her words. "You made a grave mistake today. I've done all I can for you. I can't help you with these ordeals. You're on your own now." Kiva had been on her own for nearly 10 years, even with his supposed protection. She could survive another 6 weeks, or less if her family arrived in time. The warden spun on his heel and strode away from her. Only when he reached the door to the infirmary did he pause near the guard on duty and turn back to offer his parting shot. Your father would be so disappointed in you. And then he was gone, leaving Kiva with 8 words that repeated through her mind over and over until the poppy milk began to pull her back under once more. As her eyes drifted shut, she couldn't help thinking that the warden was wrong. Her father would have been the first person to encourage her to save a life. Her mother, on the other hand, her mother would have had strong words about Kiva's actions today, but neither of them had been able to stop her, and so Kiva would just have to live with the consequences, or die from them. That was also a long chapter. I'm just going to mute myself so I can have another drink and clear this tickle in my throat. Okay, now we've got another thing unlocked, the antimatter condenser. Condense the antimatter in the universe into cookies. Nice. Genetically modified cookies. Nice, I can get some cookies as well. Oatmeal raisin cookies. Peanut butter cookies, let's get that. Plain cookies. Sugar cookies. Radium reactors. Insane oatling workers. Altered grannies. Ooh, look at them. True chocolate. Billion fingers. Ultima drill. And then there's coconut cookies. White chocolate cookies. Macadamia nut cookies. Flux capacitor. Soul bond. Warp drive. Kitten workers. Time paradox resolver. Double chocolate chip cookies. White chocolate macadamia nut cookies. And all chocolate cookies. And now I've got the hiccups. Buy 10. I could buy 1. But it is going up fairly quick, so let me just click a bit so I can get another one. $32. Chapter 14. Despite Kiva's best efforts, she wasn't back on her feet the next day. It took 4 days before she was able to stand without assistance, and even then she felt as if one of Zalandov's rail carts had run her over with a full load of aluminum on board. Lingering aches or not, Kiva stopped taking the poppy milk after her second day in bed. Part of that was to avoid building up a dependence on it, which was a risk given its addictive qualities. The other part was to save what was left of her dignity, since she'd had the unfortunate timing of taking a large dose just before one of Jaren's increasingly regular visits. When he'd sat beside her and asked how she was feeling, she said, apropos of nothing, "You have the prettiest eyes I've ever seen, like sunlight on the sea." His mouth had curled up at the edges and he'd leaned in closer. "Have you been to the sea before?" "Once," Kiva had answered. "My father took me." Jaren had misread the emotion flooding her face. "I bet he's out there waiting for you. Get through these trials and you'll be free to see him again." "No," Kiva had replied softly. "I won't." Tip had skipped into the infirmary then, something of which Kiva had been increasingly grateful for after the poppy milk finally wore off. Sorry about that, just had to have a sneeze. Where was I? It took a whole week before she began to feel more herself again. With every day that passed, she grew more and more uneasy. At first it had just been a restless desire to get out of bed, since Kiva was used to taking care of patients, not being one herself. As time went on, however, she began to struggle with her inaction, especially when Tilda remained unresponsive, and an increasing number of prisoners kept falling victim to the stomach virus that was going around. Leaving Alicia and Nurgle in charge of their care didn't fill Kiva with confidence, with the pair doing the least work possible to treat the sick while keeping their distance to lessen the risk of catching the virus themselves. It frustrated her to no end every time she had to remind them to check on Tilda or the quarantine patients, knowing that without her pushing, they would do nothing. If not for Tip, Kiva would have been pulling her hair out. Jaron, too, had been an unexpected helper, especially since he found an excuse to visit the infirmary every day, both before and after his work shifts, always under the guise of collecting various remedies for his fellow tunnelers. Even though prisoners were allowed to move freely within the walls of Zalendorf outside their labour hours, Kiva still thought he was spending an excessive amount of time in the infirmary. Whenever Nari was stationed at the door, she almost always rolled her eyes at Jaren's arrival, clearly aware that he was just making up reasons to go and check in on Kiva. Glaringly obvious or not, Kiva made sure to put Jaren to work, both because she needed someone other than Tip ensuring that the ill patients were as comfortable as possible, and also to keep Jaren at an arm's distance. As long as he remained busy, he wouldn't be sitting by her bed and engaging her in conversation. He wouldn't be subtly encouraging her to dislike the rebels. He wouldn't be hearing her spout unintentional sonnets about the colour of his eyes. That she would be happy to forget, and sought to bury it deep into the recesses of her subconscious. By the time the week came to an end, while Kiva was capable of moving around on her own again, her restlessness only continued to grow. No matter how much work she had keeping her occupied, she couldn't help wrestling with anxiety over the next ordeal. Aware that if her family didn't free her in time, she would have to complete it, she tried to envision what she might face, as if doing so would make her more prepared. Some of the scenarios weren't so bad, like having to walk over hot coals or hold a red-hot iron. Neither would be pleasant, but of course they were more survivable than being tied to a wooden pyre and set alight. That hadn't been seen at Zalendorf for a while hanging considered a faster, cleaner death, but there had been a time a few years back when a spate of prisoners had been burned alive. Whenever Kiva recalled the memories, she broke out in a nervous sweat, and her hand would automatically clutch at the princess's amulet hidden beneath her tunic. If outside intervention didn't come before the second ordeal, Kiva would have to rely on Mirren's assurance that the magic-imbued crest would protect her. The very idea of trusting a Valentis left an unpleasant taste in her mouth, enough that she couldn't help from seeking a backup plan, just in case the princess had lied. The problem was, having no idea what the trial involved left her with few options. There were salves she could rub into her skin to protect her from burning, but none were foolproof. There was also remedies that could relieve damage caused by smoke inhalation, but they wouldn't help during the trial itself. Desperate for more information, Kiva even sought out the crematorium worker Grendel, and asked if she had been approached by the warden to oversee construction of a pyre. Grendel had heard nothing, and could offer no insight into what the ordeal might be. While Kiva hated to admit it, the magical amulet was her best bet for survival, regardless of whom it had come from. But, for all she knew, the trial by fire didn't involve flames, and therefore the amulet would be of no help. She might instead have to withstand a metaphorical fire, like having to face her fears, though how a task could be designed in relation to Kiva's fears she didn't know. No matter how long and hard she thought on it, Kiva failed to Kiva failed to come up with any answers. But when the build of anxiety became too much for her sake of her sanity, and the sick prisoners who needed her full attention, she resolved not to think ahead or dwell on the possibilities. Her family would come in time, or they wouldn't. The amulet would work, or it wouldn't. She would live, or she wouldn't. There was nothing she could do in the meantime, nothing for herself, at least, but there was something she could be doing to help others. Switching her focus, Kiva sought to understand why a growing number of prisoners were contracting the stomach virus. When the first cases had been brought to the infirmary, she had diagnosed them as having a gastrointestinal infection, with such illness notorious for spreading like the plague in a confined place like Thallendal's. But aside from being messy and uncomfortable, that form of virus usually came and went quickly, with a lifespan of 2 to 5 days. It was becoming clear that Kiva had made a misdiagnosis. Not only was the virus lingering in the systems of those who contracted it, but it wasn't spreading as it should have. While more prisoners were becoming infected, there was no pattern as to who caught it, and since all of those suffering were too sick to speak in full sentences, Kiva had no clue what had linked them. On top of that, and perhaps more disturbing, they weren't getting any better. No matter how many remedies she tried, how many sedatives she gave them for rest, how many antivirals and antibacterials she shoved down their throats, nothing helped. She even tried bleeding a few of the sicker patients, and still none showed any signs of improving. They were, however, beginning to die. One by one, they were falling into the everworld, with the earliest patients already having been sent to the morgue, and many of the latter patients swiftly joining them. The incubation period was different for each person. Some died within days, some died within hours. Kiva couldn't make any sense of it, each new victim only adding to her frustration and her helplessness. Don't worry, Tip told her one night, 10 days after the trial by air. You'll figure it out. It was late, and the young boy had been running around helping Kiva all day. He was so tired that he was swaying on his feet, even though she had repeatedly told him to sit down and rest. She wanted to avoid him falling over, but she also wanted to keep him from getting angry with himself, since he always grew distressed when exhausted. When exhaustion made his stutter more pronounced. I just don't understand it, Kiva said, scrubbing her hands clean and wiping them with silverseed oil as an added precaution. She handed the flask to Tip and eyed him until he did the same. The symptoms are identical: high fever, dilated pupils, headache, vomiting, diarrhea. Don't forget the rash, Tip interrupted, handing the sterilizing oil back and wrinkling his nose at the bitter smell. And a stomach rash, Kiva added, ticking off her fingers. They all have the same thing, I'm certain of it. Then what's the problem? Kiva spun around, not having heard Jaren's arrival in the infirmary. Perhaps Tip wasn't the only tired one. The problem, Kiva said, not wasting energy asking why he was there, is that Rayla is from administration. Jaren cocked his head to the side, making the tunnel dust smeared up one half of his face even more noticeable. Am I supposed to know what that means? She's favored. Tip answered for Kiva before yawning widely and swaying again. Alarmed, Jaren reached for him, and with a look that brooked no argument, led him over to one of the metal benches and waited pointedly until he sat. While Kiva was relieved to see the young boy now off his feet, she still grumbled internally that it was Jaren's intervention that had convinced him to move when she had been begging him for to rest for over an hour. What do you mean, favoured? Jaren asked. Nari on duty at the entrance to the infirmary made a coughing sound. Kiva felt like doing the same, but instead she answered the question as delicately as she could. It means she's given extra comforts from the guards, warmer clothes, better rations, safer work allocations, that kind of thing in return for services. I don't get it, Tip said, yawning. I mean, what kind of services can she give others that others aren't giving them? They already have prisoners doing their laundry and making their meals and cleaning their quarters. There's nothing else they need. Nari coughed again, and neither Kiva nor Jaren answered. I see, Jaren said tightly, but I still don't get how Rayla from administration is a problem. The favoured prisoners are kept separate from the rest of us, Kiva shared. Rayla would have little to no interaction with anyone other than the guards that she cleared her throat and rallied on. Even her sleeping quarters are away from the rest of the cell block. Dormitories closer to the guards' quarters, or inside those quarters on any given night. Kiva didn't need to add. She shouldn't be sick, Jaren said, realization lighting his features. She shouldn't be sick, Kiva confirmed. I mean, it's not impossible that she's been in contact with an infected person, but if it were true, why are none of the guards that she's been... Kiva broke off with a quick look at Tip before turning back to Jaren. Been near not getting sick. Are you saying that none of the guards have fallen ill? Kiva swiveled to find that Nari had moved closer on silent feet, joining their conversation. None, Kiva stated, still slightly uneasy talking to the amber-eyed guard, even if the feeling had been slowly dissolving. How many prisoners are sick? Nari asked. Kiva did a mental calculation, including those who have already died, close to 70, with 10 more on average every day, and at least that many dying daily too. The quarantine room was nearly at capacity and would have passed it if not for the rapid increase in deaths. Kiva had been allocated extra workers to help temporarily care for the sick, and as had Mott and Grendel in the morgue and crematorium. Statistically, shouldn't at least a few guards have caught it by now? Jaren asked. He didn't seem at all afraid of Nari, though he hadn't witnessed a decade of guard brutality like Kiva had. If it's a stomach virus, as I had originally assumed, then yes, said Kiva. But while all the symptoms point that way, Rayla from administration proves that theory wrong. Jaren finished for her. Or really, the guards that she's been in contact with who aren't sick. So if it's not a virus, what is it? Tip asked, rubbing his eyes. That's the real question, isn't it? Kiva said, leaning back against the workbench and feeling about 3,000 years old. It could be anything. A spore in the air, bacteria in our water, mold in our grain, diseased meat or dairy. The list is endless. So we're all at risk, Jaren said, his tone part question, part statement. Kiva made a helpless gesture. I honestly don't know. Why are they sick? She pointed toward the closed quarantine door. And we're not. Why did some of them start catching whatever it is a few weeks ago, while others only became symptomatic today? She paused, considering if it's a bug in our food or water, it'd make sense that the guards aren't catching it, since they have separate supplies and meal preparation from the rest of us. But if it's something in the air, or the animals, or grain, she frowned and continued almost to herself. If I can't figure out what's wrong, then I need to find the origin of the illness. Maybe that will help me with it, come up with a treatment. But your next ordeal is in 4 days, Tip said. I think you should focus on that. Tip had kept quiet about the trials in the days since Kiva had first volunteered to take Tilda's place. At times she heard him whispering to the sick woman, who remained too delirious to talk back. Kiva knew he was worried, but she also knew he was trying to remain positive about it all, which was something she desperately needed, something she resented herself for. Since she should have been the one comforting him, but it was his sunny personality that pulled her out of the shadows when her fear became too great. 4 days is enough to get started, Kiva said, and enough for the rebels to arrive. even if there had been no sign of them yet. Sending him with a reassuring wink, she added, and I can continue investigating after the next trial is over, if she was still there. His gap-toothed grin brightened her night, bringing a warm, sweet feeling to her chest. How will you do it? Jaren asked, leaning his hip against the bench near her. Investigate, I mean. Do you have a plan? Since he'd been there scant seconds ago when the idea had come to her, Kiva had to bite back a sarcastic retort. Instead, she thought about it and said, the first prisoners to show symptoms were the quarriers, so I'll start there. I can circle around the outside of the prison, checking the farms, the lumber yard, all those outer places, before looking into what's happening inside the walls. Realizing that she was forgetting something important, Kiva turned to Nari and, with slight hesitation, said, would you mind asking Warden Rook for permission? I can't leave through the gate without an escort. Normally Kiva would have approached the warden herself, but she hadn't seen him since the night of her first ordeal. She'd awoken the next morning clear-headed enough to be horrified by how assertive she'd acted while on the poppy milk, and thought it best to avoid another conversation with him so soon. Unlike Kiva, the guard wasn't hesitant at all and gave a confirming dip of her head. Nari should go with you, Jaren said. Kiva turned back to him, barely repressing the urge to anxiously laugh. I won't get to choose who my escort is. That's not how it works. Jaren looked at the guard. You should go with her. Kiva's heart stuttered. Amicable though she might be, there was no way Nari would allow Jaren to get away with talking to her as if they had been on equal footing. I'll speak to Rook, the guard said. The breath whooshed out of Kiva. She was certain she looked like a stunned owl, blinking with shock at what had just transpired. At the very least, Nari should have warned Jaren to remember his place. He was a prisoner, and he had just made a request of a guard that sounded close to being in command. Kiva had seen prisoners executed for less. Eyeing them both, Kiva wondered if perhaps Jaren already knew all about the favoured inmates. He was young, fit, attractive, and Nari was the same. Aside from a handful of occasions, Kiva rarely saw Jaren without Nari, as if she had taken it upon herself to oversee his movements within the prison, even during his free times. That level of attention, of dedication. What's with the look? Jaren asked, squinting at Kiva. She tried to clear her expression, but wasn't sure if she succeeded. Nothing, she said, and swiveled back to Nari and said, I don't mind who escorts me, really. If given the choice between Nari and one of the other guards, like Bones or Butcher, then of course Kiva would choose the amber-eyed woman. But unlike Jaren, she wasn't about to risk making a personal request. I'll speak with Rook, Nari repeated, her voice firm enough that Kiva knew to drop it. She had no idea why the guard was being so cooperative, since there was absolutely nothing in it for her, except perhaps Jaren. The thought left a sick taste in Kiva's mouth, but she refused to consider why. Instead, she summoned the last dregs of her courage and said to the guard, the sooner the better. Nari nodded, and before Kiva could say anything else, Jaren yelped and sprang away from the workbench. What the... He bit off halfway through his curse with an embarrassed laugh as he caught sight of the soot-grey cat who had snuck out of the hidey-hole in the medicine cabinet and brushed up against him. Well, hello, who's this? Kiva had to press her lips together to keep from laughing, his jumpy reaction making her feel better about her own skittish nature. That's Boots, Tip said, pointing to her full white paws in explanation of the name. When Jaren started moving back toward the cat with his hand outstretched, Kiva's amusement fled and she warned, careful, she's moody. Jaren's eyes were dancing as he replied, she must be yours. Tip cackled, Nari snickered, and Kiva glared at all three of them. Haven't you met her yet? Tip asked, around his mirth. Jaren inched closer to the bench again, and Kiva didn't warn him off this time. Instead, she shifted further away from the cat, keeping a safe distance. I've seen her around the prison, Jaren answered Tip, but I just figured she was a stray who came and went. Tip shook his head. She's lived here forever, longer than me. He indicated where Boots' tail should have been. There was only a stumped end. See her tail? She lost it Just after I arrived, there was a riot and some of the prisoners slammed the door shut on her. Jaren winced. Ouch. Kiva had to patch her up, Tip continued, sharing his fatigue having faded with his walk down memory lane. You treat animals too? Jaren asked, brows raised. Woman of many talents. Little thanks I get for it, Kiva said, ignoring the fluttery feeling of his praise. She was a devil cat before the accident. She's hated me even more ever since. I can't go anywhere near her now without being scratched to death. Ah, Jaren said, a smile breaking out of his face as he understood her earlier warning. Or that's what Kiva assumed, until he again reached out to pet the fluffy feline. No, wait. Kiva started, only to stop when Boots didn't reveal that she was evil incarnate, and instead arched into Jaren's touch, purring loud enough for them all to hear. Traitor, she muttered under her breath. Jaren sent her a blinding grin. I have that effect on all, Moody. If you value your health, don't finish that sentence, Kiva stated, her cheeks beginning to heat. Tip started laughing again, but then it turned into a yawn so huge that Kiva was sure she heard his jaw crack. Narrowing her eyes, she jabbed a finger toward him and said, You, bed. To Jaren she added, just as snippily, You make sure he gets there without falling asleep. Jaren chuckled quietly, as if fully aware that she didn't want to be left alone with him. Not that they'd be alone with Nari there, but still, Kiva made it no secret that she was avoiding one-on-one time with him. Any more attachments at Zalandov, not even French. He wasn't getting the hint that she couldn't and wouldn't form any more attachments at Zalandov, not even friendship. Until next time, Boots, Jaren said to the cat, with one last scratch under her chin, before pushing off from the workbench and reaching Tip just as he scrambled down to the ground. See you tomorrow, Kiva, the young boy said, with a wave as Jaren began herding him from the infirmary, the latter offering one last smile at Kiva over his shoulder before he was gone. Nari, however, remained behind. When Kiva looked at her, the woman said, Are you sleeping in your cell block tonight? At Kiva's nod, Nari continued, I'll wait until you're ready to leave. Kiva had swallowed the emotion she felt, surprised to find that it was relief, not fear. The other guards were still causing more trouble than usual for the inmates, especially at night. Nari's presence would keep them at bay. Thank you, Kiva croaked out. In return, Nari said, I saw the way you looked between Jaren and me. Kiva wished she could say she didn't know what the guard was talking about. It's none of my business, she mumbled, reaching toward Boots and withdrawing her hand quickly when the demon cat hissed and then tottered back into her hidey hole. You're right, it's not, Nari agreed. But all the same, I would never carry out inappropriate relationships with someone under my charge. A weight lifted from Kiva, even if she mentally scolded herself for feeling that way. She didn't care whether Nari and Jaren were having relations, inappropriate or otherwise, or so she tried to convince herself. That's very professional of you, Kiva said, desperate for something to say. I'm sure I speak for all prisoners when I say we appreciate it. Nari tilted her head, her cropped hair and jade earring both shining in the light of the aluminum beacons. You intrigue me. What? I've been on duty here for months, Nari said, gesturing to the infirmary. Long enough to watch how you interact with others, aside from Tip, and on the rare occasion Mott and Grendel, you keep almost exclusively to yourself. Kiva was staring at her with wide eyes, surprised not only that Nari had been watching her, but also that she knew the names of the other prisoners. Most guards just referred to inmates by their job allocations, their physical descriptions, or if they were near enough to read them, their identification numbers. Why don't you allow yourself to get close to others? Nari continued, sounding genuinely curious. Jaren seems like one of the rare good ones. I think he'd be worth your time. You can hardly judge that based on the 33 days of knowing him, Kiva said, needing a distraction. She picked up an open flask and began searching for the stopper. Nari's eyes sparkled. So you've been counting the days? Swearing internally, Kiva only said, It's an estimate. 30 is an estimate. A month is an estimate. A few weeks is an estimate. Nari grinned, her teeth bright against her dark skin. 33 is an exact number. You know what? Kiva said, finding the stopper and shoving it down the lip of the flask harder than was necessary. I'm actually fine here if you want to take off. Nari laughed. It was a hearty sound, deep and almost raspy. Why don't you instead tell me what needs to be done before you can leave, and I'll help you finish up? Kiva's brain all but short-circuited, and she wheezed. What? I have 2 hands and 2 legs, Nari said, raising her gloved left hand. She added, this isn't just for decoration. Give me a task and I'll do it. Stunned by the offer, Kiva was unable to respond until Nari prompted. Come on, healer, I don't have all night. I want to make it to Vaskin before the innkeeper calls for final drinks. Only 10 minutes away by horseback, Vaskin was the closest town to Zalendov, so the guards often headed there to blow off some steam after their shifts ended. Some even lived there, especially those with families, since the prison barracks were no place for partners and children. While curious whether Nari lived on site or off, Kiva wasn't yet comfortable enough to ask such personal questions. Instead, at a daring look the guard sent her, she pushed aside her trepidation and accepted Nari's offer. Fine, Kiva said, failing to hide her apprehension. But she squared her shoulders and with more confidence shared what was left for her to do before Alicia and Nurgle arrived. She then watched with continued amazement as Nari gave a nod of understanding and rolled up her sleeves. And so the healer and the guard worked side by side into the night, the balance of power between them blurring, and perhaps, as Kiva was beginning to realize, fading entirely. No, Novak, no. Click Olympics. Make 10 million cookies from clicking. Nice. 10 million. Look at how many cookies we have now. Let's build our first antimatter condenser, because we have 4.3 billion cookies, so wow. Achievement unlocked. Antimatter. 500 million, 1 billion, 1 billion, 1 billion, 1.235 billion. That's a lot of money. How far do these go down, Chalky? Like, are these just gonna keep adding like forever, or? Also, how funny is Nari? Being like, yeah, 30 days or a month or a few weeks, that is an estimation, but 33 days is exact. She's calling Kiva out there. Bake 10 billion cookies. I can't remember what else I just got. Oh, okay. The ones you can see now as far as I can go. Right. You win a cookie. This is for baking 10 billion cookies and making it on the Nokel lose. Purchase 20 upgrades. Own 400 buildings. Woohoo, I like these. They're all diagonal. There's 104 days of summer vacation. School comes along, it's the end. What am I gonna do? 35. Hey Patrick, I know what's funnier than 24. What? 25. I can't remember what happens in this next chapter. I'm just having a quick glance. I'll at least read one more chapter, but I feel like I'm yawning a lot, so I'll just have a drink and then I'll read chapter 15 and then we'll see how we go. Chapter 15. 2 days later, the morning dawned with the threat of looming rain. But Kiva was determined that nothing was going to stop her from beginning her investigation into the origin of the stomach sickness. When she'd left Nari the night before last, or rather, when the guard had left her after safely delivering her to the cell block, the amber-eyed woman had again promised to speak with Rawdon Rook as soon as possible. And sure enough, upon Kiva's arrival at the infirmary the next morning, Nari had been waiting, claiming that the warden had given her leave to escort Kiva through the gates. Unfortunately, an influx of new patients yesterday had taken all of Kiva's time and attention, but today she'd had the foresight to conscript Alicia and Noble to swap the day shift so she could leave with Nari. After quickly looking in on the quarantined patients and checking Tilda, who continued to show a frustrating lack of improvement, for pressure sores, Kiva met Nari at the entrance to the infirmary. The guard looked the same as always in her black leather, with the slight difference being that she carried a small rucksack, and instead of having 2 swords strapped to her back, she had only one belted to her waist, with a crossbow now slung over her shoulder. Don't accidentally sell all of those antimatter condensers, lol. I won't. Good old that kid Naruto. If I had money, I would not be buying followers, that's for sure. Thanks, Novak. Kiva couldn't help an internal shiver at the sight of the new weapon, even though it was standard for all guards who left through the gate, while there was still the secondary perimeter fence far beyond the outer work areas. The long-range crossbows were an added deterrent for any prisoners who sought to try their luck at escape. Kiva wasn't stupid. She knew she had no chance of fleeing, not without help. Stay alive. Don't let her die. We are coming. Still heading to the quarry first? Nari asked, once Kiva was before her. That's the plan, Kiva said, and the guard nodded and began leading the way from the infirmary. Tip had wanted to come, but Kiva had worried about pushing her luck with the warden. There was no valid reason for him to accompany her, so she'd given him another job in her absence. It was important, since Kiva would need what he collected to be ready upon her return. But she didn't envy him the task. He, however, had responded with boyish delight, acting as if she'd given him a birthday and Yule-Mast gift all at once, something Kiva forgot. Sometimes Kiva forgot he was only 11. Nari didn't say anything as they walked toward the main gates, and Kiva followed her example. It began spitting just as they passed the kennels and approached the central barracks, and Kiva shivered as the icy droplets hit her skin. She'd grown used to enduring the bitter temperatures, wearing only her thin tunic and pants, but she always dreaded the winter months. She was lucky compared to those who had to labor outdoors, but still, cold was cold. Here, Nari said, reaching into her rucksack when the rain grew heavier, withdrawing a canvas poncho and thrusting it towards Kiva. With numb hands, from shock, not the cold, Kiva took it, staring at it mutely. Put it on before you're soaked, Nari said, as if speaking to an idiot. Kiva followed the command on instinct. The canvas was heavy on her shoulders, but she was protected from the rain and felt an instant rush of heat from her trapped body warmth. When she raised the hood over her dark hair, she nearly moaned at the difference in temperature. The last thing we need is you getting sick, Nari explained before Kiva could offer her gratitude. Alicia and Noble are useless. If anyone's going to figure out how to stop this illness before we all die, it's you. It was a valid excuse for the offering, but Kiva didn't think it was the only reason Nari had brought the poncho. Her own leathery armor protected her from the elements. She hadn't needed to bring anything for Kiva, despite her words. And yet she had. In another time, another place, Kiva wondered if they might have been friends. Even here, it was beginning to feel that way, though she didn't dare dwell on that for long, knowing how dangerous such a thought was. Guards came and went. Soon enough, Nari would be gone, like all those before her. Once they stepped around the corner of the entrance block, the iron gates rose high above them, forged into the limestone walls that encircled the compound. Railcart tracks intersected the entrance, leading from the aluminum depository and harvest factory inside the grounds, and travelling out the gates towards the lumber yard, the farms, and the quarry. At the end of each day, labourers would load the carts and return with their spoils. But right now, the tracks offered nothing more than a guiding path for Kiva and Nari to follow. With a wave to the guards up at the towers, Nari didn't pause before venturing outside, and Kiva, while on edge, kept in step just behind her. In Kiva's 10 years at Zalandov, she'd passed through the gates only a handful of times to treat prisoners who hadn't been able to make it into the infirmary without medical attention. In each of those instances, she felt what she did now, a thrill at being beyond the central compound, so close to freedom, yet still so far away. She wondered where her family was, how long until the rebels arrived to free her. Then she cast the thought from her mind, knowing there was nothing she could do to speed up the process. Today she had one goal, and she would give it her full attention. Guard Arel, a word? Kiva and Nari halted at the sound of Warden Rook's voice calling out to them, unmistakable, even with the rain still drumming down. They turned to find him striding through the gates in their wake, heedless of the water bouncing off his leather uniform. Wondering about his presence, Kiva watched the warden jerk his head toward the stables just outside the prison entrance, indicating for them to seek shelter within. The smell of hay and horse assailed her nose as she stepped inside, the rain almost deafening as it beat down on the roof above them. You stay, Rook told Kiva, before looking pointedly at Nari and walking to the far end of the stables, still within sight. The crossbow reach, but far enough away that Kiva couldn't hear what they were saying. Her curiosity was piqued, but she still had no skill in reading lips, so she sighed and leaned against the nearest stall door, petting the face of a damp-looking horse when it poked its head out to investigate. Given the wet mud tangled in its mane, she assumed it had arrived recently, the rider perhaps a messenger delivering one of the numerous royal missives that were inconveniencing the warden. That would certainly explain the dark look on his face as he spoke to Nari, who appeared nearly bored in return, her arms crossed over her chest. Casting her gaze out, Kiva took in the other horses already stabled, and the empty waiting stalls between them. Perpendicular to where she stood was a lone carriage that she recognized as belonging to the warden, having seen him use it to come and go from Zalandov, if infrequently. Rook rarely left the prison, just as the king rarely left his kingdom. Psst! Kiva looked away from the carriage and frowned at the horse that was now butting her shoulder. Psst! Kiva, down here. Her eyes widened as she peeked over the stall door and found the stablemaster, Raz, crouching near the horse's front legs. The middle-aged man held a brush in his hand and was covered in fine hair, indicating that he'd been grooming the creature upon their arrival and had chosen to stay out of sight. Kiva didn't know Raz well. In fact, she was careful to avoid him, since any interaction between them could end in either of their deaths. For Kiva, it was a risk she was willing to take, given the reward. But Raz wasn't a prisoner, nor was he a guard, and while he had been employed by Zalandov since long before she'd ever arrived, he had a lot more to lose than she did. Raz was Kiva's link to the outside world. 10 years ago, his pregnant wife had visited him during the day and gone into early labour. If not for Kiva's father, they would have lost both the baby and the mother. In thanks, Raz had offered to sneak a message out and send it on, knowing how tight the channels of communication to and from Valandor were. Farron Meriden had been clever. He'd known better than to risk prying eyes, so he'd used a substitution code Kiva and her siblings had invented for fun, one that everyone in the family could interpret with little effort, and so had begun the discourse, with Raz offering to continue his services for Kiva. Despite Raz's kindness, it was challenging for Farron, and later Kiva, to get letters out of the prison. Only a handful of times had it been worth the risk of seeking out Raz, especially with him being in the stables outside the limestone walls. Just twice had Kiva managed to send her own messages through him, the first with 3 words, "Father is dead," the second with 5, I'm the new prison healer. The letters from her family were more frequent, though not enough for Kiva's liking. Even so, Raz was always cautious about how he sneaked them through the walls, slipping them into the clothes of new arrivals, when he helped the guards pull them from the prison wagons, knowing they would be sent to the infirmary and made to disrobe. It was dangerous, but so far no one had discovered their ploy. Probably because they didn't take risks. Unlike now, Kiva had no idea why Raz was drawing her attention, especially with Rook and Nari mere footsteps away. "I have something for you," Raz said, barely audible over the continuing rain. Kiva was careful not to make any sudden moves as Raz drew a mud-streaked note from his coat and raised it towards her. Glancing quickly at the warden and Nari, only when Kiva was certain they were still talking heatedly did she duck under the horse's head until it partially shielded her, before reaching over the stall for Raz's offering. Heart pounding, she read the code, penned in her sister's familiar scrawl, excited for what it might say, hopeful for any news of a rescue. But then the words processed. And again, it's 2 lines of symbols. "Don't let her die. We are coming." The message was exactly the same as the last one. Exactly the same. Tears of anger prickled at Kiva's eyes. She balled the note in her fist, overcome with a mixture of fury and despair. But then recklessness took hold. She flattened out the parchment, dragging her hand through the muddy tangles in the horse's mane, and pressing her pointer finger to the space beneath her sister's writing. "What are you doing?" Raz hissed urgently. Kiva said nothing, only looked quickly at Rook and Nari again before silently begging the horse not to move, keeping a barrier between them. Frantically, Kiva scrawled out her own muddied code, symbol after symbol, the longest she'd ever written. And it's 4 lines of symbols. And it says, "She's sick. I'm her champion in trial by ordeal. Need rescue. When?" Quickly, she folded the muddy shorthand note and thrust it back down to Raz. "Kiva, I can't. Please," Kiva whispered, her lips barely moving since Rook and Nari had finally stopped speaking and were striding back toward her. Even the rain had eased up, as if it had offered all the help it could, and now it was done. "Please." A resigned sigh was Raz's only answer, but the sound filled Kiva with relief. He would take the note back to Vaskin with him. He'd send it on to her family, and then she would finally get some answers. Anxious sweat was dotting Kiva's forehead as the warden approached, but he didn't even look at her as he passed by and left the stables altogether, so she turned her gaze to Nari. The guard was watching her closely, as if she could see her nervous tension, so Kiva forced herself to relax. The effort proved in vain when Nari spoke. "Who's your friend?" Panic assailed Kiva, her mind screaming at her to think quickly to explain that she had no idea what Nari was talking about, that she'd never met Raz before today. But then the guard reached out and petted the horse's face, and the breath left Kiva as realization hit her. "Ah, yes, she's lovely," Kiva croaked, having no idea if the horse was male or female. She felt the mud coating her hand, mud she'd used to write her note, and held it up, adding, "Dirty, though. She needs a good clean." "You're a mess," Nari observed. She then shook her head and said, "Let's head out before the rain picks up again." Under her breath, she added, "All before Rook changes his mind about letting us go." Kiva blinked with surprise, realizing the warden must have been arguing with Nari about their task. Perhaps she should have spoken with Rook herself, sharing how concerned she was about the spreading sickness. But if she had, she wouldn't have had the chance to write to her family. If Nari was willing to fight Kiva's battles, then Kiva was more than happy to let her. Kiva didn't dare look back at Raz as she left the stables, but she mentally willed him to send her message as fast as possible, hoping her family would reply just as swiftly, hoping they would sense her urgency, hoping they would come. Let's get some more stuff. The best white chocolate cookies. Since there's like sort of not that many, so just 100 billion white chocolate coated cookies, dark chocolate coated cookies. That's a lot of cookies. Antimatter condenser, that's what it is. Same. We'll see how many pages this next chapter has. It only has 10 pages, so I'll read one final chapter and then I'll stop at chapter 17 because I think chapter 17 is the next. One more chapter and then time for bed. The rain stopped completely as Kiva and Nari continued their walk to the quarry, passing the vegetable plantation and the wheat farm, but it returned to a light drizzle when they were trekking past the pigs and poultry. It took great self-discipline not to pause at all the places they walked past, but Kiva made herself remember her strategy. She needed to start at the beginning and work her way methodically from there. On and on they walked, leaving the farms behind, with no words spoken between them. It was only when they were in line with the eastern wall, roughly, where Kiva was meant to have leapt to during her trial by air, that Nari broke the silence. I heard you met the princess after the first ordeal. What did she say? Kiva debated how to answer, but decided that nothing Mirren had told her, other than about the amulet, would get either of them in trouble. I think she was mostly curious about me and why I volunteered. That's all. Apparently I remind her of her girlfriend, Kiva shared. Something that about how I have the same kind of fighting spirit. I think maybe it was meant to be a compliment, she shrugged. Honestly, I was in a lot of pain when we spoke, so even with Poppy Milk I couldn't get a good read on her. Nari turned to Kiva. Princess Mirren has a girlfriend? Kiva shrugged. Again, that's what she said. Looking closely at Nari, she added, You're not one of those royal-obsessed fans, are you? Desperate for any scrap of information? Of course not, Nari said, frowning. I'm just surprised. That she's in a relationship? Nari said nothing, her silence confirmation enough. Kiva snorted, then remembered who she was with and tried to turn it into a cough, resulting in a disgusting sound that she was grateful no one else, like Jaren, was there to hear. What's funny? Nari asked, proving that Kiva's attempted cough had failed. It's just Kiva trailed off, trying to think of the best way to say what she was thinking without upsetting the woman strapped to the teeth with lethal weapons. I'm guessing the king and queen don't make proclamations regarding the dating status of the kids. If Mirren were to become engaged, then sure, the kingdom would hear about it, but just having a girlfriend, Kiva shook her head. Sorry, but you can't be surprised about not knowing that. Again, Nari said nothing, but then, apparently you have the crown prince to thank for saving your life. Pulling a face, Kiva said, I don't want to talk about him. I hear he's handsome, Nari commented. Kiva nearly tripped over her own feet. Are we seriously having this conversation? I'm just saying, some people dream of marrying a prince. Kiva spluttered, unable to repeat the words. Are you insane? I can't think of anything worse. Especially when it came to a scoundrel like Deverick. Barely a few minutes in his presence, and a saviour or not, Kiva had been ready to throw something at him. The guard laughed, whether at Kiva's words or her disgusted expression, Kiva wasn't so sure. Then what do you dream of, healer? I have a name, you know. I know, Kiva sighed. I have a lot of dreams, a lot of nightmares too, only time will tell which path my life will take. There was a weighty pause before Nari said quietly, You are wise for your years, Kiva Meriden. You're wise beyond your years, little mouse. A lump rose in Kiva's throat at the memory Nari's words had brought forth, something her father had said to her every time she came up with a new remedy or treatment that he hadn't considered. Smart as a whip, our Kiva. Her mother used to go on for him, telling anyone who would listen, and smiling proudly at her daughter. Sorry, I've lost my place. Tears prickled Kiva's eyes, and she blinked them back, no longer having the cover of rain to conceal them. She looked ahead to see how far they had left to walk, relieved to find they were already passing the abandoned quarry to their right, with their destination in sight straight ahead. Kiva had never visited the abandoned quarry. It had been depleted a few years before she'd arrived at Zalandov. The labourers were relocating further north to the much larger mine where she and Nari were now headed. She'd heard rumours that while the abandoned one was smaller, the prisoners had been forced to dig so deep into the earth that numerous cave-ins had occurred, resulting in multitudes of deaths. Similar accidents happened in the newer quarry, though less frequently. How do you want to go about this? Nari asked, as the sounds of hammers and chisels meeting rock began to reach their ears. She indicated the bag Kiva had brought with her and added, The quarry is huge. Do you know where you want to get the samples from? We need to go where the largest concentration of workers are, places that lots of prisoners have access to or spend most of their time. Nari's reply was dry. You're making this up as you go, aren't you? It wasn't a question, so Kiva didn't answer, though her cheeks did warm slightly. This way, Kiva said, as the tracks came to an end. Rail carts were piled up, empty and waiting for the prisoners to load them and push them back into the depository once their shift was over. It was hard work, grueling on the body and mind. Warriors, like tunnellers, rarely survived long at Zalandov. There was only one watchtower overlooking the quarry, but there were plenty of guards on the ground making sure the prisoners were working, and providing motivation when they weren't, their whips and canes stained with blood. The quarry overseer, Harlow, was the worst of them, and he scowled at Kiva and Nari as they approached where he waited at the base of the watchtower. I heard yous was comin', Harlow said, chewing with his mouth open and then spitting a wad of black gum close enough to Kiva's feet that she wondered if he'd meant it to hit her. She wouldn't have been surprised, though it would have made her less inclined to ease his discomfort the next time he came to see her about his chronic venereal rash. Kiva couldn't have wished such an ailment on a nicer man, and she took great delight in giving him remedies that stung and burned his nether regions, conveniently overlooking the solution that would heal him in a trice. Perhaps he should have spat on her. He certainly would have done more than that if he knew the last remedy she'd given him was deliberately inflame his symptoms, enough that it should be some time before he had the ability to partake in the activities that had resulted in the ailment to begin with. Served him right. We won't get in your way, Nari said in a cool voice. Better not, Harlow said. And don't yous bother my workers. None either. I ain't payin' 'em to slack off. He laughed suddenly, one hand clutching his barreled stomach as he arched his back and guffawed. Payin' 'em? Ha! Imagine that! Kiva shared a look with Nari, whose expression was equally repulsed. We won't stay long, Nari said, though whether that was to Kiva or Harlow, Kiva was unsure. Yous can stay as long as yous want, just not down in the quarry, Harlow said. He eyed them both and licked his lips. Yous can come down in my quarry any time. In fact, why don't we... We won't stay long, Nari repeated firmly, her lip curling with disgust. She turned on her heel, and with a pointed look at Kiva to follow, strode purposefully away from Harlow. The last Kiva saw of the repugnant overseer as they crested the lip of the quarry was what was scratching his crotch, and the image had her biting back a laugh. "He's a pig," Nari said, as she came to a stop to look down over the choppy laid vista spread out in the distance. "He's worse than a pig," Kiva said. Deliberating for a second, she quietly added, "But if it makes you feel any better, he's suffering in silence as we speak." When Nari looked at her in question, Kiva shared about Harlow's condition and the newest remedy she'd prescribed him. The guard laughed so hard that she had to wipe tears from her eyes. "Remind me to never get on your bad side," Nari said, still chuckling. "He deserves it," Kiva said. "That he does," Nari agreed. She waved at the view before them and said, "I don't want to give him a chance to come and hassle us, though. Where to from here?" Kiva chewed her cheek. Considering the topmost layers of the quarry had already been mined, so there was now a significant and sheer drop down to where the prisoners were chiseling away at the lower edges of the pit. The land itself was an arid grey, but shimmers caught in the light every so often, hints of glittery aluminum threading throughout the stone. "Why don't we just follow the path until we hit the bottom, and I'll find some places to take samples once we're closer to the workers," Kiva finally said. Nari started down the slope, her steps confident, while Kiva picked her way more carefully. It was wide enough for a cart to fit, but all she had to do was twist her ankle on a loose stone and she'd be in real trouble. Unlike Nari, Kiva was neither athletic nor strong. Life as a prisoner failing to provide much in the way of fitness, the labourers were the exception. Being forced to work under such grueling conditions meant they could not be fit. It was that or die, and they almost always died anyway, just like Jaren would. Kiva pushed that thought aside. She'd known from the moment she'd met him that he'd be allocated a labour job, and it would lead to his death. There was nothing they could do about it. And there was no point in dwelling on it. Zalendorf was cruel. It always had been, and it always would be. But for the first time in a long time, Kiva wished she could stop the inevitable from happening. "You're quiet." Kiva's head jerked up at Nari's words. "I'm just watching where I step." Nari let it slide, even though it was clear she knew Kiva was wrestling with her thoughts. Soon the noise became so much that they weren't able to easily converse anyway, with the sound of hammers smashing into rock and picks chipping away at stone echoing loudly in their ears. Given how expansive the pit was, more prisoners were allocated here than anywhere else. At any given time, there were upward of 700 quarriers, most perishing within a year, and it wasn't just there was space, and it wasn't just that there was space for them. It was also because of how vital the aluminum was, not only for power and lighting, but also infrastructure and architecture. The more labourers there were, the faster the aluminum could be extracted, with a further 300 or so prisoners allocated to the depository inside, the gates where they processed the mineral and prepared it for shipping to the rest of Wenderol. It was a well-oiled machine that relied on the lives and deaths of prisoners. As Kiva and Nari made their way past the first grey-clothed workers and the guards watching over them, the clanging of tools was augmented by the tangy smell of sweat and blood combined with the chalky scent of quarry dust. A few people glanced their way, but no one stopped them. The dirt-covered prisoners had little energy to spare for curiosity, and the guards were watching their charges closely, whips in hand, and ready for the slightest hint of anyone slacking off. Kiva's chest burned with resentment. But she made herself remember that she was here for one reason only, to collect her samples. If she figured out where the sickness was coming from, she'd be able to keep all of these workers from dying even more prematurely, for what it was worth. As they walked along the lower levels of the pit, Kiva signalled to Nari when she found places that she had seen or were currently seeing higher levels of contact with the labourers. Pausing each time, she scraped samples into the flasks she'd brought with her, before continuing down the path. Mostly she searched for stagnant puddles of water and small blocks of mud that had a mixture of quarry minerals all mashed in together. especially when they were all trodden by prisoners' footprints or nestled into rocky crevices near where the labourers worked. It was just as she was about to tell Nari that she had enough samples and was ready to go that a scornful voice called out to her, "Well, well, well, if it isn't Zalandov's expletive." Kiva turned woodenly to find Cresta standing before her. The redhead's face was smeared with quarry dust, her serpent tattoo almost appearing alive beneath the luminous grime. The last time Kiva had seen her, Cresta had been threatening Tip's life. So far, Kiva had upheld her side of the bargain to keep Tilda alive. But the look Cresta was now levelling at her served as a clear reminder that she still had work to do. Zalandov's rebels wouldn't be happy until their queen was free, and perhaps with them with her. A shiver ran down Kiva's spine. She hadn't considered what would happen when the rebels came to rescue Tilda. Would they be taking others with them, too? Others like Cresta? Kiva shook off the thought, determining that it wasn't her problem. She had enough to deal with without the moral fallout from such a decision. "Do we have a problem here?" Nari asked, stepping closer. "Look at you with your babysitter," Cresta sneered at Kiva, ignoring the guard, other than for a slight tightening of her fingers around the pickaxe she held. "How does it feel, working in your castle while the rest of us slave away here?" On the one hand, Kiva couldn't believe Cresta had the audacity to not only snub Nari, but to continue antagonizing Kiva with the guard right there. On the other hand, this was Cresta, and she'd always done whatever she wanted and somehow survived the aftermath. "I'd hardly call the infirmary a castle," Kiva returned in an apathetic tone. "But I guess it's all about perspective." With clear deliberation, she turned her back and began to walk away, saying to Nari over her shoulder, "I'm done here, let's go." "That's right, healer expletive, run away like you always do," Cresta called after her. "Better rustle up some courage before your second trial, you're going to need it." Kiva ignored Cresta's cackle, certain that if she looked over her shoulder she would see the warning in the young woman's eyes. Despite her feigned scorn, Cresta was well aware that Tilda's survival was tied to Kiva's success. "Want to tell me what that was all about?" Nari asked once they were far enough away. Want to tell me why you didn't punish her?" Kiva replied. Nari was slow to respond, but eventually said, "Did you want me to?" Kiva sighed and hoisted her bag of samples higher off onto her shoulder. "No, never mind. You didn't answer my question." Kiva remained silent for a long while, thinking over her response. It wasn't until they were out of the quarry and following the rail tracks back to the prison gates that she finally answered. "I represent everything Cresta hates about Zalandov," Kiva said. To her mind, I do exactly what I'm told, when I'm told, and it's true, I do. Because unlike Cresta, Kiva cared whether she lived or died, and she found that being obedient was more likely to keep her on this side of the otherworld. She played the game, having chosen long ago to sacrifice her soul in order to save her life. The other prisoners resented her for that, especially the rebels, and yet she was still breathing while many of them were now dead. The carvings, Nari guessed. "Among other things," Kiva said. "Plus I kept her alive when she first arrived here." A confused pause before Nari said, "Usually people are grateful for that. Not if they want to die." A loaded silence met Kiva's words, during which time she recalled how Cresta had tried to kill herself in the early weeks at Zalandov, using glass shards to slice open her wrists. If not for Kiva's quick actions, the angry young woman would have died. It was Kiva who had unintentionally lit a fire in Cresta after that, telling her that she was strong and powerful and she could survive anything, and that she owed it to herself to find a reason to live. Cresta had done exactly that, rallying the prison rebels and deciding that her purpose in life was to cause as much conflict as possible, for guards and inmates alike. "You're really good at making friends, aren't you?" Nari said in a dry tone, prompting a reluctant chuckle out of Kiva. "It's one of my truest talents in life," she replied just as dryly. But as they continued back toward the gates, and Kiva caught the small smile lurking on the guard's face, she wondered if maybe she wasn't so bad at it after all, and that thought made her stomach tense enough that she refused to consider it further. Instead, she focused her attention on returning to the infirmary and testing her samples, while distracting herself from the upcoming ordeal and the very real threat of death looming over her head. And that is the end of that chapter. And we are up to chapter 17 now. I'm on page 176, 403, and we're at 42%. So we're almost at halfway. Very close to halfway. And Novak has gone to sleep, so thank you everybody for joining us here. I'll just quickly spend some of these some of this stuff, so that'll be fun. Until next time, I've almost bought all the stuff that I currently can, so we'll just leave it at that. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you Novak for resubscribing earlier. Thank you Sharky and Ali and Novak for being in the chat. And we will see you all in the next video on Tuesday. And Sharky will see you all again on Monday night with another enthralling installment of Sharky Goes Retro and Pokemon. So thank you all for joining us. And we shall see you next time. Bye bye.